The most devastating moment of my existence occurred when my romantic partner betrayed me through infidelity and subsequently burglarized my residence alongside her new companion. Her lover not only stole my relationship, but also depleted my entire food supply. The woman I cherished deeply insulted me by calling me pathetic and without any talents. Allow me to recount the events that preceded this catastrophe. In the year 2050, our planet descended into an epoch of worldwide glaciation. Survivors who escaped death by freezing succumbed to starvation instead. I was scavenging for sustenance when seismic activity shattered the frozen surface below my feet. I plummeted into a crevasse and managed to grab an implement to anchor myself against the wall. My fall ended atop a commercial establishment entombed beneath the ice. Fortune smiled upon me as I avoided death. Yet this remained the most terrible day I had ever experienced. I made the horrifying discovery that cursed creatures dwell beneath the frozen layers. These abominations prey upon humans, and in their eyes I represented nothing more than a delectable meal. I fled desperately for survival. Death was not an option yet, not before I could embrace my beloved one final time. A massive chunk of frozen matter descended from the cavern's roof and impaled the beast's skull. Miraculously, I survived this encounter, but then an avalanche cascaded from overhead and entombed me as well. Fortunately, the burial was not lethal, yet that creature was not my sole adversary. An unknown entity invaded my physical form, and I experienced an alien sensation within my being, though its nature remained mysterious to me. I dismissed this concern upon realizing the location was actually a deserted store. That confection bar represented an extraordinary rarity. I collected every edible item I could locate. During my journey homeward, I encountered numerous other individuals struggling for survival. In this pandemonium, every person becomes a potential threat, so vigilance and constant awareness were essential for safety. Upon reaching my dwelling, I performed the coded knock sequence to signal my girlfriend for entry. Each time I returned from endangering my life in the glacial wasteland, she would comfort me with her embrace and speak words that ignited passion within my lower anatomy. However, securing the entrance thoroughly always took precedence for protection. I presented her with the precious gift of a chocolate bar. She expressed gratitude through a kiss. But when I turned away and informed her that no other food had been discovered beyond the chocolate, she regarded me with that expression and departed. Several days elapsed, and I succeeded in acquiring additional nourishment this time, sufficient quantities to begin agricultural cultivation. Then my girlfriend performed the secret knocking pattern at my door. When I opened it without hesitation, a club struck my skull violently. The impact was so forceful that it launched me across the space, and I collided with the opposite wall. Chen Ming had turned against me and held me responsible, claiming I had concealed food from her knowledge. Due to this accusation, she selected another man as her companion. That scoundrel had the audacity to declare that someone as feeble as myself was unworthy of possessing such a woman, and claimed he would save me from perishing of hunger in the wilderness. They assaulted every portion of my anatomy. My girlfriend mocked me until the very end, and that is how my life concluded. But then something inexplicable occurred once more. That identical feeling. I felt my flesh tingle and abruptly regained consciousness. I was certain that death had claimed me. I had experienced the agony. It could not have been merely a dream. That is when I gazed through the window and comprehended the truth. 24 hours remained before the world would begin its freeze. Somehow I had traveled backward through time. I recalled that particular day. In multiple locations, citizens were demonstrating against the corrupt administration. The wealthy elite were celebrating and ridiculing the impoverished. Criminal organizations and thieves were conducting their regular business. Now only 23 hours and several minutes remained before chaos would commence. I was convinced it was not merely a dream. Those illuminations in the heavens were present, and they initiated everything. If this was reality, then this was the moment she would contact me. My prediction proved accurate. My treacherous girlfriend was calling. I could not forgive those cruel words. I had been deceived by her beauty and ignored her actual character throughout our relationship. I answered the telephone. and her first action was requesting money from me. This relationship had to end. I told her coldly that we were finished, and terminated the call without listening to her response. Since fate had granted me another opportunity, I would not allow that woman to betray me again. Proper preparation was essential. In our protagonist's previous existence, he was unaware that within 24 hours, everything would begin freezing, and within 4 hours, snow would blanket everything. The urban chaos filled with demonstrations would worsen the already dire situation. He needed to accumulate as many resources as possible within 60 minutes. Beyond basic necessities, he required defensive equipment for this chaotic situation. Therefore, he intended to search for something like a firearm. Law enforcement officers observed the youth walking and decided he appeared suspicious, wandering at this hour, so they should collaborate to apprehend him. One officer exited the vehicle and shouted to Mo, commanding him to halt. Aiming his weapon at him, he ordered Mo to place his hands in visible positions. His colleague spoke into the radio, reporting they had a suspect on 4th Avenue, while the officer inquired about what he held. Meanwhile, the young man analyzed the officer's bewilderment. He explained he was merely holding his mobile device. But the countdown reached 0, and he reflected that he lacked time to waste on a law enforcement officer like this. So he hoped they would release him following an inspection. The officer warned that at such an hour he should not approach without caution. Meanwhile, his colleague asked about the backpack contents and instructed him to surrender it. Mo clarified that it contained only items from his workplace, retrieving a blue notebook from his bag. In a panic, the officer screamed that it was a weapon and discharged a round at Mo. The projectile rushed toward the boy mercilessly. The young man thought this was the end. His opportunity to live was about to conclude here, but then he rejected that thought, telling himself he would survive. His eye began glowing with electric blue patterns. An energy field surrounded Mo as the bullet approached. The young man wondered what was occurring, because he could perceive the bullet's path, questioning whether time had decelerated for him. So he tilted his head sideways, realizing he could evade it, and it was not an illusion. He cursed the officer, stating he was a citizen and the cop had no authority to shoot him. Then he charged toward the officer, saying he could not waste time on idiots. The bullet missed and struck the pavement. Instantly, thin ice layers formed over it. Mo moved so rapidly toward the officer that he left trails behind him, delivering a punch to his face, fracturing his jaw and causing him to spit blood. The officer collapsed onto the ground beside his overweight partner. The second officer trembled as he looked behind him, seeing his colleague completely devastated from the impact, wanting to understand what had just occurred and what had done that to him. The officer fell to the ground in terror, pointing his gun at Mo. He demanded to know what he was. But the young man calmly approached the man, saying that even he did not know what he was. And then a single scream echoed through the Brooklyn streets. After the incident, the overweight officer reported over the radio that an officer was down and a suspect had fled with their firearm. He repeated his call, urging the station to respond. As a trail of blue energy formed ahead of him, he muttered that his day was cursed, leaving a glowing trace behind him. Mo sprinted away, heading toward his home in apartment 409, and collapsing onto the floor as the energy dissipated behind him. The young man took deep breaths, shaken, wondering if what had just happened was real, wanting to know how he had managed to do all of that. Then he picked up the gun, determined to test whether he could do it again. He aimed the pistol at the mirror and fired a shot, his ice power activated, turning one of his eyes. Mo suddenly moved forward, catching the bullet in his hand. He grinned excitedly as he realized what he had just done, wondering if he had awakened some kind of superpower. Looking at his shoulder, which was covered in ice, he questioned why, since the global freeze had not even started yet. Could it be because he moved with the bullet like a supersonic jet? Perhaps he concluded that this ability affected his speed. It might not seem too sophisticated on paper, but with his knowledge of the apocalypse, he was already one step ahead of everyone. A knock came at the door, making him turn to see who was looking for him. It was an elderly woman named Mrs. Fang. She questioned little Mo about what that gunshot was. The young man made up an excuse, saying it was just his TV, that he had broken the remote and apologized for the noise. But the woman sighed, reminding him not to forget what had happened at the nearby supermarket. The streets were not safe, so he should be careful. Mo thanked her and apologized for worrying her, but she simply returned to her apartment, saying that young people should not overwork themselves. And then she closed the door to Mo's apartment. The young man quickly shifted his focus back, returning to the main problem of resources. Remembering the supermarket that the old lady mentioned, he realized it might have everything he needed for the apocalypse. So, with a wicked smile, he decided he would stockpile his food. At the supermarket, the cashier yawned quickly, while a security camera recorded the shelves. It captured only Mo looking at the food. But in the blink of an eye, he vanished into a blur. The girl did not even notice, continuing to yawn in exhaustion. But then an enormous receipt appeared on her screen. She wondered what it was and if someone had made a purchase. Reading a note at the bottom, she saw a message telling her not to be scared and to go home to stay safe. That made the girl question the strange receipt. First, they were robbed, and now they were receiving odd messages upon checkout. However, at the same time, two men entered the store. One of them had a pistol in his hand. The girl sighed, wondering what was going on these days. But then the man pointed the gun at her head and apologized, because this was a robbery and she needed to hand over all the money in the register. He told her to hurry up while an icy aura crept toward the store. The gun began to freeze from the cold. Then the entire store followed, coated in frost. A leg stepped inside as one of the robbers asked why it suddenly got so cold. His partner ordered him to turn toward the door, so he did, and came face to face with a tall, slender white armor. The thief demanded to know what that thing was, what kind of monster it was. His partner immediately fired at the creature, but the bullets simply curved around its bluish blood. The thief screamed that they could not kill something like this, firing again as the creature's hand reached for him. The monster grabbed the thief while commenting on his face, slowly peeling off his skin with its fingers. Then it ripped off the man's face, saying he tasted bad. The cashier held up her phone, determined to record this. A video captured the monster devouring the thief. Police officers watched the girl's live stream on their phones, commenting that this format was popular. But then an error message appeared on the screen, making them wonder if it was a government emergency alert. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the city, warning all citizens. Mo opened his door, hearing that this was a broadcast from the Department of Logistics and Security for the Homeless. He was surprised. It was starting already. The city was experiencing an unexplained cold wave, and everyone was instructed to shut their doors and windows. The cold wave was coming, and Brooklyn would be the first to suffer. An hour and 9 minutes had already passed since the beginning. Inside Building 58 of the new district, in an ordinary apartment, the alert urged citizens to pay attention. It repeated that this was a message from the Department of Logistics. Meanwhile, Officer Joe commented that it must be serious if they were getting involved. A girl smoked a cigarette while watching the alarm on her phone, and Mo used a screwdriver, thinking that there would not be any setbacks. Luodong flicked his lighter and asked if the man was not going to talk. Beaten and bloodied, the man weakly said he truly did not know anything. So Dong pulled out his phone, asking if he still did not recognize it, demanding to know what was in that photo because he had drugged the boss's daughter. The man sobbed, insisting he did not know at the time. But Dong crouched down, telling him that he should start praying, so at least God might have mercy on him. He stretched out the man's hand and drove a knife through it. He mentioned something about counting from 1 to 5 inside his box. Inside the box were 6 severed fingers. One of the henchmen asked what they should do with this guy, but the young man said that the sin of lust deserved death by fire, so they should throw him into the boiler. The subordinates hurled his body inside, then they sealed it shut. One of them muttered that the boiler was old and might explode, but the other told him to shut up. Luo was waiting for them. However, the henchman near the boiler suddenly noticed something was wrong. A massive explosion erupted from the apartment. His friend grabbed onto his arms while his partner cursed, covering himself in the growing shadow. The screwdriver slowed to a stop. Mo declared that the plant cultivation structure was finally complete. With his current supplies, even if he did not leave, he could survive for quite a while, but it still was not enough. because supplies would eventually run out, and sustainable self-sufficiency was the key. His plan was to build the perfect survival chamber, one that could sustain itself indefinitely. He picked up his phone, noting that the freezing phenomenon had been going on for almost an hour now, and he needed to hurry, because this was the time to speed things up, since in this world, time was life. But then a knock came at his door, and the young man wondered what it could be. As he opened it, he questioned why the sensation felt so familiar. Officer Joe apologized to Mr. Mo for disturbing him. Mo then asked old Joe what the problem was, wondering what was going on. Joe explained that the temperature had suddenly dropped and the heating system was broken, so he was warning everyone to stay safe. Mo remembered something happening last week. The malfunction was not fixed in time, and when he had gone to repair it, it was already completely broken. He could not repeat the same mistake. He had to fix it. He asked the officers to let him take a look. Then, he closed the apartment door behind him. Climbing the stairs, the officers asked where he was going, and Mo asked if the boiler room was not supposed to be here. Joe explained that the boiler was in the basement. They needed to go downstairs. Mo reflected on how the boiler room was illegal in the apartment complex. Fang had mentioned it before, so it should be upstairs. He wondered if he was developing early amnesia. Inside the basement, Joe commented on how cold it was. Then Mo noticed something strange about the smoke. It felt like cold air. Joe led him toward the boiler. Mo tinkered with it, saying, "It should be fine now." But then, he noticed a blue liquid on his hand and wondered what it was. Joe's partner asked if there was a problem, and at that moment, two white skins appeared behind him, exploding his head while screaming for fingers, saying that they were growing back. Mo questioned how this could be a white armor, while Joe panicked, asking what that thing was. Overcome with terror, he was paralyzed. The white armor prepared to attack. Mo activated his ability immediately, dashing in front of Joe and pushing him down to prevent the white armor from striking him. He sprinted away, muttering that old Joe had almost lost his head. He noticed that the door was still open, so he bolted toward it. If he ran at full speed, he could escape, but the white armor caught up right behind them with its mouth wide open. Mo wondered how it could keep up with his speed. Then the monster nearly struck him. Mo questioned if this was happening because he was carrying old Joe. So, he picked him up in his arms, apologizing mentally, because he would have to throw him toward the door. Then he hurled old Joe with all his strength. Joe went flying, shouting, "What is going on?" Crashing outside, knocked unconscious. Mo turned back toward the white armor, but the monster attacked with its head. The young man panted as he dodged the blow. That white armor kept repeating the word finger. Mo wondered if his power was connected to old Joe, trying to understand why this was happening and how his ability worked. He recalled holding old Joe and realizing that without him, his speed increased, but his ability was limited. The monster turned to attack again. Lin Mo blocked the strike, saying that his condition had nothing to do with the white armor, because it was clear that when he threw old Joe, something strange happened due to his energy activation. He wondered if there was some kind of connection between them. Noticing the pebbles on the ground, Mo finally understood his condition. In his past life, humans faced the white armors with no chance of survival, so all he could think about was running. But now things were different. Now he was the hunter and no longer the prey. Mo grabbed a stone from the ground. This time he was not running. He readied an attack, gripping the pebble in his hand, taking a baseball stance, charging his energy into the throw. Then he hurled it toward the creature. Mo's assumption was correct, just as he thought, because his ability could only affect targets contaminated by his energy. With kinetic acceleration, the energy amplified, and even a tiny stone, when sped up to a certain degree, carried the power of an electromagnetic railgun. Blood splattered onto the ground. It was dripping from Mo's eye. He questioned what was happening, noticing that his blood was blue, and wanting to know what was going on. Mo collapsed onto the ground, vomiting blood, falling unconscious, unable to move. His last thought was about how cold he felt. But before his vision completely darkened, old Joe approached, holding the young man, calling him Lin, and telling him to open his eyes. Inside Joe's house, his wife commented that the wind was too strong, At this rate, they could not take him to a hospital. Meanwhile, the boys struggled to get the main door open. Joe ordered them to block the wind and turn on the heating. His wife worriedly remarked that the boy looked poisoned as they shouted for him not to fall asleep. The officer found Mrs. Fang and started talking about Lin Mo, but the woman cut him off, telling him to stop talking and go find Xiao. Xiao approached, asking Joe to excuse him. She told Joe to leave Lin Mo there, and Joe commented that the boy would be fine. The doctor continued, saying the officer should check the stairs because it was a mess, and despite his body temperature being so low, he was still alive. She wondered if he was some kind of cryogenic person. The doctor began recording a report stating that the male patient was suspected of poisoning and was still in a coma. His vital systems were abnormal and his body temperature was around 10 degrees, but his pulse and nerve reflexes were in normal condition. She turned off the phone, saying it was unbelievable. The blood separation process was complete, and she needed to check the results. She realized it was something she had never seen before, because before centrifuging, the blood looked no different from normal blood. But afterward, blue impurities were separated. Since the analysis would take time, she needed to continue observing the patient's surface characteristics. Even on his body, if not looked at closely, the markings could be mistaken for veins, but upon closer inspection, they resembled an allergic reaction. Suddenly, Lin Mo opened his eyes. The doctor asked if he had finally woken up. While the young man tried to understand what was happening to him, the woman continued telling him not to walk around like a headless chicken. While Lin Mo wanted to know who she was, Xiao lit a cigarette, saying she was an unlicensed doctor and for some reasons could not reveal her real name. But he could call her Dr. Joe. She then asked how he ended up in that state, because, to be honest, she had never seen these symptoms before and wanted to know what had happened in the basement. She was very interested in him. In Brooklyn, the temperature had dropped to 29 degrees Celsius. The world record for the lowest human body temperature was 13.7 degrees. While the human body could tolerate 0 degrees Celsius, prolonged exposure froze tissue and destroyed cells. Temperatures below 32 degrees Celsius caused hypothermia, and humans could not survive in 29 degrees Celsius, or with a body temperature lower than 13.7 degrees Celsius. After explaining this, the doctor removed the thermometer from Mo's mouth, telling him to take a look. His current body temperature was 11.5 degrees. It was a miracle he was still alive. Lin Mo could only wonder how this was possible, trying to figure out if it was because of his ability, but he did not have time to dwell on it. He needed to complete his plan quickly. Dr. Joe smirked, saying she understood. Lin Mo then slipped on the water on the floor, falling and hitting his head as Joe turned around annoyed, telling him that she had ordered him not to move since his body was weak. But that was not the real issue. She had discovered what was wrong with him. She asked if he had a superpower, shocking the boy, who wondered how she knew. However, he did not have time to waste on her. He scoffed, asking what kind of joke this was. But Joe explained that she had been observing him as a doctor. The young man thought that as long as his ability was active, even if he had to climb everything again, it would be faster. But then, blue blood dripped onto the floor. The doctor asked if he was okay as he coughed up blood. He realized he could not accelerate now, and based on his past experiences, he knew what was about to happen. Meanwhile, Dong walked toward a door, saying that after meeting with Dr. Joe, they needed to behave a little better. His subordinates understood. Then he stopped in front of apartment 509. Inside were Joe and Lin Mo. The young man was startled, wondering what was about to happen. But Joe gritted her teeth and told him to get up. He needed to move, asking for Lin's hand. Lin sat up on the stretcher, asking what the problem was, but the doctor ordered him to lie back down. There was no more room for questions. The young man needed to understand why all of this was happening so suddenly. Joe told him that if he wanted to survive, he had to do exactly what she said, telling him to wait and not move under any circumstances. Then she pressed the button to open the door. Dong stepped inside, apologizing for the intrusion. He was greeted by Dr. Joe, who asked what he wanted. The man asked if he could come in for a quick chat, and the woman told him to do as he pleased. Inside the house, Joe asked what he needed. The gangster explained that he had heard the resident of apartment 409 was receiving treatment and had something to discuss with him. Joe replied that the person he was looking for had died from poisoning. Dong simply sighed, saying that was unfortunate. Lin Mo recognized Luo Dong's voice and wondered why he had appeared here, if in his previous life he had been completely frozen before showing up. If he could use his acceleration ability now, he could take Dong's life himself. The gangster notices something strange and turns around, saying that Dr. Joe had been working hard all this time, but he had seen the patient blink, so he wanted to be sure that he was lifeless and asked what she thought about him helping to check. Joe says that she had already told him the truth. Then Dong presses the ignition of her lighter, saying that the doctor had saved so many of his brothers on the street, and there was no way to repay her, because it was his fault and the woman should not be upset. But she should not forget who was taking care of the clinic and her, so she should give a quick answer about something. Then he leaves the apartment, telling her to think about it, and Joe complains that it was nonsense. But she tells Lin Mo to get up because Dong had already left, and she thought he had many questions to ask. Lin Mo asks why Dong wanted to take his life this time since there was no reason, like in the past life, and also why Joe was protecting him. But before anything else, he asks the doctor where his clothes were, and she wonders if that would really be his first question. Brooklyn reaches 40 degrees Celsius. One of Dong's henchmen comments that when he was young, he watched his father take care of the furnace and felt that he could not be a loser like him, but now he admires him. His friend replies that it was just the messed up weather outside and he did not need to lament over his father. DeLong asks if he thought everything would improve in a few days, and the subordinate apologizes. But the man adds that government messages used to be broadcast every 20 minutes, and now even the internet has stopped as if they had given up. So this sudden cold wave must be God's punishment for humanity. Joe, who is tied up, asks why God does not punish a sinner like him. Then Dong approaches and says he was just managing the apartment and wanted to know if the order he created was not harmonious. But the officer complains that he ordered everyone to leave and get supplies for him, or else he would cut off the heating. The gangster asks if it was not fair since it was an equivalent exchange. Joe simply calls him a parasite. Dong turns around saying it was a shame Lin was not among them. Otherwise, he could be benefiting from someone else, leaving Joe in shock because of that. Joe asks if Lin was already dressed and tells him to come to her when he's done, but the young man was struggling even to get dressed. He asks what she needed, and the doctor wanted to know if he had any idea how long he had been unconscious. The young man guesses 6 hours, but she replies that it had been 6 whole days, completely surprising him as she explains everything that happened during those days, since DeLong controlled the heating system, forcing residents to trade supplies for it. Many people were forced to go outside, which was the same as losing their lives willingly, since those who went out thought they were going to heaven anyway. Lin Mo curses him, saying that no matter where he was still a beast. Then he asks if there was any way to recover his body. Joe smiles while the cigarette is still in her mouth, saying yes, and if he wanted her to tell him, there had to be a condition since she runs an underground clinic and she does not do charity. And she asks if he would accept. Lin Mo asks what the condition was because he would agree as long as he could do it. Then she holds his chin and says he has to be her research subject and allow only her to study him, reassuring him that her research would not bring him any harm, since, as she had said, she was very interested in him. Lin Mo, with a smile, responds that the deal is done. Then the woman explains that there was a special substance in his blood, but she had not yet discovered what it was. What was certain was that it absorbed thermal radiation and converted thermal energy into usable energy for the entire body. But absorbing too much made his body cold. Simply put, his body suddenly had a way to store energy, so he was just hungry. Lin Mo asks if eating would be enough to recover. The doctor agrees, but the amount he needed to eat would be huge, and she did not have that much food. The man tells her not to worry because he would figure it out. Then he heads towards his apartment through the emergency stairs, thinking that it was good he had prepared in advance and planned to go to the supermarket to buy some supplies, moving stealthily against Dong's henchmen because as long as he got home safely, it would be a victory. opening the door of apartment 409 and pressing the button on his key. He notices that everything inside was frozen. Linmo wonders if they cut off the heating in his room because that could freeze someone to death. But because of Dong, his room had turned into an igloo. So he opens a box saying it contained the highest calorie food. Inside were stacks of chocolate bars. He remembers Ming Ming and says he needs to change this brand the next time he buys chocolate. Then he bites into the bar with all his strength. However, there was no reaction, and it seemed like that amount was not enough. So he needed to increase the dose. So he does, eating chocolate non-stop and feeling the sensation, because it was as if something inside his body was craving heat, and it was a bad feeling like he was about to lose control. The henchman opened the apartment door, asking why it was unlocked, since the boss was planning to cut off the man's fingers to force it open. But today it just opened on its own, and there were tons of supplies inside. Lin Mo smirks while eating the last chocolate. The henchmen ready their weapons and ask who he was and how he opened the door. Joe in her lab reflects that the final simulation report was ready, and she should see exactly what was inside his body, noticing that the reversal process affected neural activity. Therefore, that was bad. If too much glycogen was replenished, he would become different. One of the henchmen yells that it did not matter who he was because everything there belonged to them. Lin Mo's previously bluish energy turns red as he enters a state of madness. 72 hours earlier, Joe went to the boiler room and asked what had happened there to turn room 409 into this, noticing something strange forming on the floor and wanting to know what it was. But she collects it as a sample, saying it was interesting. However, a camera was pointed at the place. She says it looks like she will have to go to the security room to find out the truth. From a recorder, a man starts an announcement, telling all residents to pay attention, because they should distribute supplies rationally to avoid waste. Dong's henchmen grab Joe by the arms, saying he was too heavy, but his friend reminds him not to forget what the boss said and to keep an eye on the boiler. Dong continues, saying that all residents must pay a small compensation in exchange for heating, and a drunk man asks if this was some kind of joke from Joe, but his colleague replies that it did not seem like the old man. Then the gangster explains so that everyone understands the seriousness of the situation, walking over to the heating switch, saying he would turn it off for a while to save some resources. With his lunatic expression, he shuts it down. Lin Mo suddenly wakes up facing a man who asks if he hates. The boy was dressed like a prisoner and asks what he was supposed to hate. Then the figure asks if he hated Dong, repeating the name Luo Dong. Lin Mo replies that it was obvious he hated him, grabbing one of the henchmen by the neck while emanating his energy. The henchman is surrounded by a red aura. Then Lin Mo's eye turns the same color. He thinks that the henchman was Luo Dong, saying that human flesh and beef tasted similar. Then he hurls the man far away, sending him out of the building and making him crash to the ground while burning in red energy. The people outside are shocked, seeing the completely charred body in front of the building, saying that he looked like he had fallen from the 4th floor. His friend asks what just happened and who Lin Mo was, wondering if he was an alien. As he approached him, he notices the energy and questions if it was a red aurora, quickly realizing there was no way to win against Lin Mo, and rushing at the man, planning to do whatever he could. But the hooded figure smiles, seeing the image of Lu DeLong in the henchman. He uses his speed to appear behind him, shocking the boy with his incredible speed. Lin Mo calls him to come at him, trying to provoke him. And so the henchman swings at him, but the man was no longer there. Trying to strike again, Lin Mo appears behind him, thinking of Luo Dong, telling him not to move. Then the hooded figure prepares his hand, stretching it back as the henchman runs toward him, and then activating his power with his eye, dashing forward and slicing the man's body in half. Someone suddenly opens the door. Ming Ming calls out to Lin Mo, shocking the boy with her presence. He looks at Ming, who was pointing a gun at him. Then shooting a dart toward his stomach, he asks why. Joe says it was just insulin, making Lin Mo's aura dissipate. And as he falls into her arms, the doctor explains that it was to break down the excess heat in his body. But she looks ahead, astonished. Because all the plants had bloomed, she wanted to know what had happened there. Hunger is a catalyst for human atrocities, from eating each other to wars, which are things that repeatedly occur throughout human history. But as agricultural technology developed, human society gradually stabilized. However, hunger never left them. For in a frozen world, cultivation is an almost impossible task. History was about to repeat itself. But there is always an exception. Lin Mo rests peacefully with his head nestled against the vegetation. Joe mentions he hasn't been conscious for very long and needs additional rest time. He offers his apologies, yet she desires to understand the nature of everything surrounding them. Grasping a tomato in her palms, she bites into the red fruit moments later. The physician attempts to evaluate the flavor, stating the taste proves quite pleasant, with sufficient volume to nourish everyone in the entire structure. A pair of individuals traverse through the frozen precipitation. A young woman's belly rumbles audibly, causing her to feel ashamed of the noise. Her companion inquires about her condition and whether she can endure. Yet the woman simply responds that it shouldn't pose any difficulty. Her friend then touches his jacket and mentions he just recalled having a chocolate bar. She attempts politeness and declines the offer, though the man explains the bar nearly got taken by Dong and he believed it was in this particular jacket. His spouse instructs him to cease searching and questions whether he has forgotten, since they provided the chocolate bar to their child that very morning. The husband faces her with amazement. He then chuckles, stating he entirely overlooked this fact. Criticizing himself for being worthless as a Talon materializes near his head, obliterating the man's face with one devastating blow. His spouse remains frozen in horror at the events that just unfolded. They now confronted an enormous pale armored beast clutching her husband in its grasp, before consuming what remained of the man's form. His crimson fluid spatters across his spouse's features, while the pale armored beast declares she appears appetizing. The woman gazes upward, questioning what this entity could be, though someone with blonde hair screams at her to avoid remaining motionless, causing her to pivot toward the sound and flee from the creature. The blonde individual calls for the woman to approach him and to run for her survival. The woman escapes from the pale armored beast, though the creature attempts to seize her with its appendages, while the woman only glances backward, stumbling in the snow and rolling away. She crashes heavily onto the surface and attempts to rise as the creature pursues her, weeping while begging for her existence. The blonde individual seizes a bottle of liquor with a cloth and sets it ablaze with a flame, hurling it at the beast, which gets struck, causing a detonation. Fire fragments land on the woman as the creature becomes engulfed in flames, screaming its hatred for heat, providing the spouse an opportunity to flee. Approaching the structure, she believes the creature might not have pursued her. Spotting an elevator, perhaps she could find rescue. Yet the creature remained behind her, completely stunning the woman who desperately wished to survive. She weeps once more and frantically presses the elevator control, while the pale armored beast continues calling to her. The woman screams at the cursed elevator to accelerate, though the blonde individual emerges, commanding her to shut her eyes, entirely surprising the woman who hadn't anticipated this. Illumination begins flashing, blinding the beast, which cries that it despises brightness, while the blonde individual raises his arm, grasping a pick between his digits, preparing to perform a rock melody. He then strums his guitar to rescue the woman. Sonic waves burst outward, while the beast screams its hatred for rock as it convulses in pain. The woman's identity was Dorothy Perez, whose childhood aspiration involved becoming a physician. Upon maturing, she finally achieved this goal, becoming a nurse, though she felt dissatisfied with her surroundings. Then she encountered Matt, who consumed his meal bashfully beside her, while she also appeared thrilled to remain at his side. Following this, they became wed. Their child was then born. Eventually, they relocated to a new residence. Yet this was something she understood well, whether the world suddenly became frozen or criminals invaded the residence. She dreaded what might follow after experiencing so much, wanting to comprehend current events, since that man with merely a guitar managed to subdue that creature, which was certainly the most absurd occurrence of all. The man completes his melody, lifting his arm high into the atmosphere. The beast then attempts to grab him, stating that sound was annoying. Though breathing heavily from his brief performance, The man simply steps on a control on the floor, releasing metal bars from the ceiling, which fire toward the beast, penetrating it and catching it unprepared, confining the pale armored creature among the debris. The creature's appendage trembles in its final moments. Dorothy, amazed, questions whether it has ended, collapsing to the surface as she weeps, stating it was finally concluded. Yet she gazes ahead carefully, still overwhelmed by everything that had occurred. The blonde individual extends his arm toward the woman, informing her that everything was acceptable now. Dorothy sits before a campfire, absorbed in contemplation. She examines a photograph of her family while her husband's features are stained with crimson. The man hands her a fabric, instructing her to allow her husband to rest peacefully, sitting next to her as he continues talking. Since from dust to dust, from ashes to ashes, they needed to protect the living rather than mourning those who perished. Dorothy observes him with an unusual expression. The man then ignites his cigarette and tells her not to worry, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere between them. Dorothy presents herself while the blonde individual stammers slightly, stating she could address him as Corbin. The woman expresses gratitude while looking aside, while Corbin acknowledges her appreciation. Dorothy inquires whether he was also venturing out to seek supplies. However, Corbin states his circumstances were somewhat complex, opening his guitar case and requesting a moment to show her something, since he arrived from Seattle seeking a friend. Yet upon arrival, he became trapped by the cold wave. He then provides her a photograph stating his friend was the one wearing the hat, and they used to perform together in a band during high school. Dorothy immediately identifies Lin Mo in the photograph and states he was the individual who resided in apartment 409. A loud sound then shakes both of them, and Corbin asks what was occurring. Since the entire city was trembling from the event, he questions what those entities were, as a pale armored creature stomps on the surface, while another has its neck torn open, and a third possesses elongated appendages, an entire army of pale-skinned beings advancing. Dorothy notices the direction. They were traveling since it was toward the apartment structure. Lin Mo finally awakens, wondering how he lost consciousness, and before him is a woman's form. Startled, he attempts to understand what is occurring. Joe finishes doing something behind him and asks whether he was conscious already since she had placed something on him, making Lin Mo question what was positioned on him. Though the young man was restrained in a chair and the physician tells him she installed a safety measure on him, revealing a collar around his neck. Collars are among the oldest decorative items, and their significance has always evolved. In the past, they were a symbol of bondage, representing control and possession, though now they can also be a plaything for adults. Joe states Lin Mo shouldn't worry since the collar on his neck was definitely not for those purposes. He inquires about it, thinking he wouldn't have considered that way if she hadn't mentioned anything, telling her he agreed to be her research subject, though not for this. The physician states the collar was a special monitoring device and that Lin Mo was a research subject, asking whether he remembers the things inside his form, since they help him absorb heat and store it. However, it seemed to have another function, and this collar was made to prove that hypothesis, since when his blood sugar levels are high, it will activate another state, and the collar will change from blue to red. Lin Mo asks what she was discussing and what this other state was. The physician then questions whether he remembers what happened 20 minutes ago. The young man is surprised by the question, noticing he can't recall what had happened. Joe tells him not to worry while placing her finger on his face, stating it's fine if he doesn't remember since she was there to figure out what was happening. Since all of this was part of her research, Lin Mo thinks he always felt like this woman had some control over him, though he really wanted to know what was occurring, since once he found out, he would definitely gain some advantage over her. Joe presses a control on her keyboard, injecting something into Lin Mo's bloodstream, which makes the young man glance to the side and see an IV drip. Questioning what it was, he notices it is glucose with a 25% concentration. The physician turns, noticing the reaction it caused, and states first she will record the data. While Lin Mo just wanted to know what was happening, Joe smiles and states she almost forgot. She kneels before Lin Mo, and the young man asks what she was planning. The woman then places a plant between his legs, completely surprising the man with the unexpected action. He quickly looks at the plant. His gaze starts to turn red along with the marks on his form. Red energy then fills the room. He shouts that the physician dared to deceive him, though his other self appears, stating it was interesting. Stepping out from behind Joe and walking toward Lin Mo, he approaches the small branch of the plant, making it grow and then bear tomatoes. He then asks whether Lin Mo could see him now. The young man asks what was occurring, while his other self states it was nice to meet again. Lin Mo questions whether he was his other self, attempting to tell the physician he was hallucinating, though his other self explains the physician couldn't hear him. Now, Lin tests it for himself, realizing there was no reaction when he spoke. He asks whether this was the work of that entity. The other self explains that in a way it was, though not entirely. Lin Mo grows irritated and asks what he meant by not entirely and who he was. Besides the fact they looked the same, the being explains they were both together, to be exact. After all alone, he couldn't have reached this level. He pulls down his hood, stating that regarding his identity, that should reveal who he was. Lin Mo is shocked when he sees. After all, his other self's eyes were bluish, and he asks whether Lin remembers. The young man states he was the parasite from back in the cave, while the parasite confirms it, showing the mark on Lin Mo's back. He explains his powers and the ability to resurrect were thanks to him. Transforming into a woman, she tells them both to get along. The National Security and Logistics Bureau was a branch of the agency, also known as ASLN, and was one of the few departments that could operate independently. The logistics agency had its own medical unit, administrative units with capable people, and even military units. This agency was considered the last safeguard of civilization in the world after the government collapsed. Someone calls out to Xiao Lu asking whether the network had not yet been restored, while the woman had a photo of herself and Joe on her desk. Xiao Lu states Miss Barbara had asked the same question 28 times in the last 2 days. Barbara then sighs, looking at her partner. Xiao Lu begins to explain about the information department and a hardware issue, though Barbara shouts she already understood. She has the surname Ripley and is a level 4 leader in biochemistry, stating that, to be honest, they were just passing responsibility around. Barbara asks whether the report was complete, and Xiao Lu states it was almost ready. The woman states that was good enough and it should be sent to her first, while her subordinate questions about the rest. With disdain in her voice, Barbara states the bald guy wouldn't read it seriously anyway, since the situation was urgent now. She opens a government document. She thinks it was all starting again, while her bald boss complains this was not the time to discuss such things. Frank Cordick, a level 2 minister, shouts that first there were climate changes, then cyber attacks, rendering communication useless. And even the frontline operators had been out of contact for 48 hours, not to mention their agents had not been properly activated. Therefore, they were in trouble and needed to act. He states war never changes, and his soldiers, though he is interrupted by a kick from Barbara straight to his lower parts, stating he shouldn't be worrying about political matters right now. In the sample observation room, she asks whether he understands her urgency. Frank stares ahead, stunned, while Barbara explains the pale armored beast was found near the bunkers. The creature merely repeats it was just a husk. Zalo states the beast was a mutated human. Frank questions this, though Barbara tells him to look at the creature's neck. The bald man starts to focus, noticing a collar on the beast, which he identifies as a member of the Field Operations Department. He wants to know what was occurring there, while Barbara explains it happened before the network went down. A signal from a missing agent was detected near the bunker, though when the department found his form, he was already lifeless and his code name was Silver Hammer. She explains 24 hours later, the form underwent a mutation and became what they were watching now. Shallow adds they had obtained some information from the CIA, and this beast was being monitored even before the Cold Wave and other related events. That footage was from the same supermarket, and those two were the first creatures temporarily referred to as husks. An image of Lin Mo appears on the screen, and she states they had been calling him Number 0. The young man wonders what was occurring there. since just a second ago the parasite was an insect, though now it had turned into a woman, whom he actually finds quite beautiful. The parasite smiles while looking at Lin Mo, stating humans get shy when they see the opposite sex naked, then sitting on the young man's lap, making him wonder whether it was an illusion, since the surroundings seemed as if time had frozen. The parasite states he could think of it that way. Lin Mo is startled, asking whether she could hear what he was thinking. The parasite then explains that yes, she could since they were now fused, while Lin Mo complains the explanation was weird. The woman states he could only see her because of Joe's sugar, while Lin Mo realizes it was an illusion, then asks whether the parasite had been activated. She twirls her hair in her hand and states that, strictly speaking, that was his blood, and that was the part that granted Lin Mo his abilities. The young man asks why she was parasitizing his form. The woman states he was a curious creature, since she was different from humans and didn't belong to this dimension, making Lin Mo repeat that statement in disbelief. The parasite continues stating they needed to parasitize the forms of natives to gain the ability to understand this dimension. The young man complains it sounded like something out of a cheap romance novel. The parasite states her race has no name or definition, traveling between dimensions without perceiving time, though unable to interfere, needing hosts to break barriers. However, she admits it must be hard for humans to understand, stating they wanted to hear their own names and see the castles built over time, yet they couldn't interfere with the world, questioning how they could prove their own existence. Lin Mo asks whether this was existentialist philosophy, since, from what she was stating, she sounded quite lonely. The parasite is suddenly surprised, then bursts into laughter, asking whether he was feeling sorry for her and if this was what humans called empathy. Choosing humans as hosts then seemed to have been the right answer. She embraces him, stating his current expression was cute, though she had some bad news. Since the moment they fused, Lin Mo had become a target for the husks. The pale armored beasts advanced toward the apartment, taking the form of wolves that gather together. Their leader comments the scent there was of food, though he also smells an enemy, ordering his group to move toward the structure. The beasts crash into the building. Lin Mo asks what the parasite meant by husks, while she responds he would find out soon. However, if he needed anything, he could seek her out since he now knew how. The parasite then claps her hands, and time resumes its normal flow. Meanwhile, a vial falls close to the surface. A severed head lands beside it. A woman runs away from a pale armored beast, in a corridor filled with lifeless people due to the sudden attack. The structure's residents run, rushing down the stairs, though a man is cornered by two creatures, banging on the door and shouting it had locked itself at the worst possible moment. The pale armored beasts finally reach him, penetrating his form as they break through the door. Lu DeLong's subordinates had been taking care of Officer Joe, though they prepare to fight as the beasts invade, asking what the hell those things were. Joe only watches as the two men are impaled by the creatures, wondering what those things were, since they looked like the beast from before. He notices some red points on the creatures, questioning whether they were sucking blood. However, the creatures hadn't noticed him yet, and he needed to find a way to escape. It would be difficult to break the rope without tools, and the pillar had no sharp edges. He decides to resort to an old trick from his youth, gripping his thumb with the other hand and pushing it downward to dislocate it, freeing his hand from the rope with ease. Joe states it was good to have those old injuries from his youth. Now his fingers tend to dislocate easily. He attempts to move stealthily since the creatures don't seem to have noticed him. However, he realizes in this situation he couldn't leave empty-handed. Joe thinks he needs to find the security vault, and luckily the thieves hadn't realized it was a weapons cabinet, though a pale armored beast appears before him. Joe curses the whole situation out loud. Meanwhile, Joe comments that just as she suspected, the plants respond to his influence capable of growing rapidly, while Lin Mo asks whether she could undo everything. The physician states that although he can do it, the boy cannot use the ability for long periods or he would end up weakened. She has collected most of the data she needed, and Lin Mo yells at her to hurry up and help him undo it. A tremor shakes the room and Joe questions what that sound was. The door of the room begins to rattle. Frightened, the physician asks what is happening. Linmo is surprised and asks whether it could be a creature. One suddenly appears in the room. He notices it is a pale armor. The parasite whispers in his ear it is the shell. Linmo turns around asking why she is still there, though the being puts a finger on his mouth, stating this was not the time to be thinking about that, since if he doesn't act fast, Joe will lose his life. Linmo activates his ability and rushes forward, questioning why all the women around him are so difficult. He picks Joe up in his arms while apologizing and asking for her permission. He then flees far away using his powers. The beast attacks the wall since Joe is no longer before it. Linmo lands on the surface, still holding the woman, and asks whether she is okay. However, he notices the woman's embarrassed expression. She touches his chest and states it was fun to experience his ability like that. Linmo helps her up while they both face the creature. Joe questions what it is, and her friend responds he doesn't know, though it is definitely dangerous. Calling for Dr. Joe while stepping before, since he wants to deal with that beast. Joe reminds him he shouldn't overuse his abilities, and the boy agrees, stating he wants to tell her something. Since, although she is a bit clumsy, judging by the results, she really helped a lot, and he thanks Dr. Joe. She is completely surprised by this, and questions why he is bringing this up now. Linmo prepares for battle and states they can deal with those small matters later, since he will make sure to properly thank her. Several pale-skinned beasts appear in the room to face him. The boy is taken aback by this, wondering whether it could be a collective action. Dealing with one was easy, though with so many, he might fall into a weakened state again. Joe asks what's wrong since she was eager to see how he would thank her. Lin replies that maybe she should wait a little longer. The creatures then charge at him, realizing he will have to face the pale armored beasts head-on. He prepares a combat stance against them. Joe picks up the tablet and states that since this is the case, she should test his limits, monitoring his glycogen at 100%. Lin dodges a beast, thinking that if he keeps using acceleration continuously, he will end up weakened before finishing them. Though he grabs one of the creatures, stating he has a way, since he only needs to use the power when necessary, throwing the beast toward its group. The beasts regroup to attack, and Lin thinks they are not as dumb as they seem. Though he is no longer the creature's prey, Linmo activates acceleration in his eye, noticing that when the ability is activated, time slows down for him, allowing him to observe the beast's movements and predict their attacks. Thus, he dodges the strikes, realizing that with this, he doesn't even need full-form acceleration. The same applies to his attacks, advancing against the beasts again, even unarmed. As long as he accelerates his fists to a certain degree, he can trigger a supersonic explosion, destroying everything in the room. Linmo turns to the remaining creatures and asks whether they are afraid now, since he is just getting started. Joe, analyzing the data, comments that although calorie consumption hasn't decreased, the efficiency of ability usage has been optimized, since in all this time he has consumed less than 10% of his energy. She finds this interesting with a smile on her face, calling Linmo a test subject, and telling him he could unleash himself with that previous move. Lin complains that, as he suspected, she was monitoring his form condition. The creatures charge at the boy, who prepares his strike, shouting the physician is a fraud while unleashing a blast of power. Linmo takes a deep breath after the attack. The veins in his neck have already turned blue, and his arm is still consumed by energy, though his glucose consumption is still at 83%. The physician approaches, stating he has mastered his abilities very well. The boy just turns to look at the woman. She continues, stating she has a question, since he seems to know a lot about these things, ordering her test subject to tell her everything he knows while exhaling smoke from her cigarette. In the boiler room, the form of the pale armored beast stretches out in blood. Joe was unconscious beneath the creature, though suddenly he opens his eyes. Looking around, he asks what is happening and notices the blood on the floor. He pulls the knife from the creature's belly. While attempting to understand what just happened, he moves the creature aside. He remembers the fight he had against the beast, and that if he hadn't had the lever, he would have been finished. Though he walks out of the room thinking about what would happen if the creatures appeared again, and he wasn't as lucky. A vibration comes from the phone in his pocket, making the man question whether the network was still down. Though the call was from an unknown number, Joe puts the phone in his pocket and the caller greets him with a good morning, Josh Castillo, asking whether he should call him Mr. Curved Blade. Lin Mo explains everything he knows to Joe while thinking he wouldn't mention having lost his life once and traveled through time. The physician changes her outfit and comments she expected as much, though if he was done talking, he should help her with the zipper. The young man zips it up while she explains it was a prototype environmental protection suit from her previous job, while Lin questions the sudden outfit change. Joe tells him to look at the ceiling, since the pale-skinned beasts had invaded the vents. They might have damaged the ventilation and asks whether Lin hadn't noticed the temperature drop. A noise is heard outside. Both go to the door, finding Dorothy's child. Joe comments it's just a child, and Lin states she's his neighbor. The little woman runs, while the young man chases after her as the physician states she hates kids. Lin is surprised when he looks down the hallway, since the path is covered in blood and the little woman is pointing. Joe notices several corpses on the floor and states they are residents of the structure, while Lin wonders why all of them have gunshot wounds. He approaches the child, telling her it's dangerous around here, though the woman points to old Joe, who was lying on the surface. Lin thinks he had already lost his life, and in his previous life it had been Joe who took the initiative to share food, though he also lost to a pale armored beast. He touches the form's shoulder, stating that in the end, good people never get a happy ending. Suddenly, Joe grabs Lin's hand, which startles him, making him scream dramatically. The old man explains he hadn't passed on yet, though still owed Lin one. The little woman grabs Joe's hand, asking whether she is a physician, since her mother said physicians wear clothes with red crosses, and she had one on the back of her hand, asking whether she could help Uncle Joe. Joe looks at the child without reacting, though she steps closer, stating she will make an exception and won't charge anything. She kneels beside Joe and asks what happened to leave him in this state, though Joe states it's a long story. Since after leaving the boiler room, his plan was to get to the security room, though the first floor was full of creatures. He ended up climbing the emergency stairs and found several survivors along the way. Since the creatures were coming, his only option was to keep going up. Though that's when something happened. Luong appeared with a firearm, shooting survivors in the head as they climbed the stairs, leaving the forms for the pale armored beasts to devour. Joe asked what the man was doing, though Dong commented he was simply using the weak to buy himself time, shooting at the other survivors along the way. While aiming at the woman, he stated the strong had always been above the weak, since it was a rule established by God, firing his weapon again, hitting Joe, who stepped before the shot. After that, Dong kept going up while Joe lay there bleeding until he lost consciousness. Joe states that fortunately, the bullet didn't hit a vital point, though he lost a lot of blood and needed to get to a safe place. Linmo repeats the name Luodong with rage, stepping forward as Joe asks what he plans to do. The young man looks back while activating his abilities. Dong shoots at other people along the way who scream for him to wait, stating they are human, though the man contradicts them, stating they are just weak meat, and that having forms everywhere was good since it was enough to slow the creatures down. Since although that place was an old warehouse, it should be the safest spot in the structure. He opens a door hoping to find supplies inside, though he notices a dark presence coming from the hallway. Linmo pulls down his hood, stating he is facing the man once again, calling out to Luodong with anger. The gangster fires at the young man, asking whether he wasn't supposed to be in hell, though Lin dodges all the shots while charging toward Dong, landing a kick that severs his leg, then lunging forward with his hand shaped like a claw, slicing off the arm, holding the gun, and grabbing Dong's head with his hand. The man asks why he is doing this while Lin heads toward the balcony, since he hadn't even done anything to him yet. Linmo questions how he could state he hadn't done anything, though he realizes nothing from his previous life has happened yet. Though after coming back, he never sought revenge as he only wanted to create a safe place for himself. However, looking at the situation now, that had been foolish as innocent people lost their lives. All of this made him furious, though it was clear his anger wasn't just toward Dong, since he also felt anger toward himself for being such an idiot, burning Dong's form with his power and hurling it toward the pale-skinned beasts while declaring that now, if he were to do it again, he would do the same to his enemy 100 times over, since that was the law of the frozen world. Joe and the little woman warm themselves by a fire. Joe comments the structure manager used this place as a storage room, so it could be useful to them since there were still some supplies left. Lin Mo sits in the corner near a crate, thinking he finally got his revenge, though it didn't feel like it was enough. The physician interrupts him by smacking his head, asking what he is thinking, since she already suspected he had issues with that bastard, and it was normal for people to become compulsive when they had great power. Though in Lin's case it was different. Thanking him for getting rid of Dong, Lin asks whether she also had problems with the gangster. The woman recalls moments from her past with him pointing a gun at people. The young man stands up and states the physician doesn't have to answer if she doesn't want to, since they would be staying there for now and since it was used as storage, the heater didn't work. Seeing how the place was, everything still seemed intact, though old Joe was injured and Maggie was just a child, so they wouldn't be able to rely on the fire in the barrel forever. With dangerous pale-skinned beasts outside, they needed to reinforce the room's security, and they could use the available materials for that. However, if they wanted real warmth, they needed to go to the power room. Joe comments the structure is full of creatures and fears what could happen if they don't do something about it. Maggie suddenly sneezes while they are talking. Lynn states she could end up with hypothermia if she stays still like that, and Joe explains there is only one way. Inside a garbage tunnel, footsteps are heard. Mo suddenly falls out, landing face first on the surface, grumbling about it being the garbage tunnel of all places, though he is surprised when he looks ahead, seeing a beast that looks like a core. He wonders whether the pale-skinned beings have fused with the residents, forming a nest. He turns around, noticing a strange noise, wondering whether it could be a pale, armored beast, though Joe suddenly falls on top of him. On the surface, Lin comments the physician is stopping him from getting up. The physician retorts she can move if he takes his hand off her. A sudden noise is heard, and she signals for Lin to stay silent. The beast then looks to the side, passing by them unnoticed. Joe asks what that entity was, while Lin wants to know why she even came there. She explains 2 people are needed to operate the power room, and since Lin's form is in a weakened state, he might pass out there. The creature then suddenly charges toward the wall where they are hiding. The young man wonders what kind of creature that is, as it is different from the other pale-armored beasts, and he is too weak to fight it now. He could end up dead. According to the physician, the pale-armored beasts don't eat people. They only drain and store their blood, though he wonders where all that blood is going. Maggie looks out the window and asks Joe what is happening, shocking the old man with the terrifying sight, since the pale-armored beasts are spreading across the structure, and a female is lying on the surface with an immense belly. Corbin comments she looks lifeless, and Dorothy states she won't attack them anymore. However, a light appears from the structure, and a man is identified as Morse code. Dorothy asks about Morse, and Corbin explains it is a signal language allowing communication through different letters of the alphabet and numbers, depending on the pattern used. Joe from the window signals with the light stating they should understand and not go there. Corbin is surprised by the code, and Dorothy questions what they are attempting to say. The young man understands little, though tells the woman they are asking them to go there. Both move toward the structure while Dorothy appears hesitant, and Corbin states her child should be there, though Joe does not want the 2 of them to take that path. Still in the nest, Lin thinks they need to follow that route, though a pale, armored beast is blocking the entrance. He has no choice, though, to fight the creature. Cracking sounds come from the ceiling, drawing the beast's attention. Lin and Joe take the opportunity to move forward, thinking this was a perfect distraction. The physician comments the veins on the floor seem connected to those who lost their lives. Lin agrees and states it's bizarre to use humans as part of a nest when suddenly something emerges behind him. It is a pale armored beast with a skeletal structure. It takes on a humanoid form resembling a lich. The beast plunges its claws into its stomach cavity, extracting entrails and fashioning them into a blade before bringing the armament crashing down. Lin detects an anomaly and condemns the entity. He forces Lin away while quickening his pace. The entity rushes to assault them both as the youth attempts to reach Joe, receiving wounds across his spine to protect his companion from harm. He retreats, supporting the woman, declaring that the entity moves with superior speed. Since that pale-plated entity surpasses the others in strength, Lin rests his palm upon his shoulder blade. Contemplating the immense power of that pale-plated entity, the beast suddenly emits a noise, its gaze completely fixed upon Joe. Lin Mo questions why it targets the physician instead of himself. Yet the entity lunges ahead with its blade. The youth successfully forces Joe away, though receives cuts from the weaponry. That beast moves too swiftly, creating challenges for Lin to endure. Since if the entity continues this assault pattern, both he and the physician could perish in this location. He considers whether death approaches once more. The organism emerges discussing escape, inquiring whether that behavior defines his species in such circumstances. Since, as he understands, within this frozen realm, compassion does not exist. It represents a domain where all beings share equality. Therefore, abandoning the physician might ensure his survival. Lin declares he refuses to flee, since doing so now would create no distinction between himself and Luodong, stating he requires no abandonment of his moral nature for survival. Astonishing the organism with his declaration, Lin clarifies that if she exists within him, she must comprehend when blameless individuals forfeit their existence. His torso throbs and breathing becomes labored. That agony represents his moral essence suffering similarly to ancestral remains, which display breaks demonstrating they never deserted their allies. Consequently, Lin can envision only one possibility now. Given his possession of this capability, he will ensure its utilization to his benefit, developing vessels throughout his form and protrusions. The emblem on his pendant starts being devoured by the vessels as the pale-plated entity advances toward Joe wielding its blade. The physician experiences terror and perspires, yet the entity's strike meets resistance. A bluish pale-plated entity positions itself before her, and Joe inquires about its identity. Lin embodies that monster and proclaims that through this capability, he will safeguard individuals. He observes his resemblance to that pale-plated entity, though he tightens his grip as he perceives no similarity. The youth channels force into his palm and his monstrous form radiates blue illumination. The organism remarks this proves intriguing since she apparently selected correctly, and the youth will now experience power's true nature. Lin then advances to strike the entity, delivering a blow the monster blocks. He moves forward again, executing a sideways kick. Though the monster evades, Lin has gained velocity, yet insufficiently. As the monster maintains its evasion, Joe wonders about these events since he has developed a new surface layer, as though absorbing atmospheric energy and transforming it into strength. Yet, considering their location, she questions whether this constitutes unlimited energy and what defines this power's essence. Lin decides to temporarily ignore his similarity to the pale-plated entities as the monster attacks him. Despite possessing this capability, Lin struggles to defend and combat the entity, avoiding the monster's assault narrowly, connecting with a glancing strike on the entity. They clash, and Lin believes he can accelerate temporal flow, questioning whether he might achieve the reverse. The entity charges with an angled attack, then retreats from Lin, moving directly toward Dr. Joe without pause. Lin focuses his energy into his fist, attacking the entity's core. The monster, which had been preparing to assault the woman, halts in time merely 1 centimeter from striking her. Lin believes it succeeded, though he prepares to move, declaring this moment, since he will eliminate the monster with one attack, cutting repeatedly across the entity's dorsal area, naming this technique Shadow Fist. Time resumes normally and an explosion happens. Joe collapses onto the floor, drenched in the entity's blood, while Lin offers his hand and states they must depart, as remaining proves impossible. With the temperature achieving 26 degrees Celsius, Joe observes their success, while Maggie celebrates the warmth and expresses desire to see her mother. A sound emerges from the cell and Joe questions its source, considering whether it might be a pale-plated entity. Lin opens the entrance, informing elderly Joe of his return. The elderly man welcomes him, stating they have finally come back. Yet the youth asks about his condition while Joe advises against agitation since reopening the wound would require her to repair it. Joe mentions hearing a noise in the ducts earlier and suspects a pale-plated entity. Lin examines the ducts, questioning the sound, suggesting it might merely be aging pipes adjusting. He reassures elderly Joe not to worry, as it likely represents an illusion, and the pale-skinned entities remained concentrated on lower levels. Nevertheless, the duct suddenly fails. An unusual figure drops before them. Joe raises his pry bar, confirming his suspicion, while Lin activates his ability and questions whether they had transformed into a blood nest. Though Maggie calls for her mother, Dorothy responds to her child, asking about her presence there, while Corbin protests about the heating duct's excessive temperature. Maggie explains that a pale-plated entity invaded their residence, and a fair-haired man shot numerous people, though Uncle Joe rescued her despite injury, and the dark-haired man saved him. Corbin calls Lin Mo an odorous child, surprising the youth that someone recognizes him. The fair-haired man approaches rapidly, expressing how much he missed him. Lin attempts recognition while stepping backward, though Corbin embraces him, stating he traveled entirely from Aberdeen and crossed the complete continent. The youth immediately engages his ability, striking Corbin's face and demanding how he dares. He questions why Corbin seems so familiar, while the fair-haired man asks how he could act thus. After all, even his father never struck him. Lin wonders whether this person also originates from this timeline like the physician and appears to know him, though he never possessed friends in Aberdeen. Corbin grasps Lin's arm, declaring he will establish a new band, and Mo will serve as Slash's second while he becomes Hrix's first. As Maggie inquires whether they share friendship, Lin feels shocked since he merely wants to identify this fair-haired man, noting that timeline differences compared to before might be explained through the butterfly effect. After all, the future had been modified, though no explanation exists for Corbin, stating he could only consult the organism. He enters his mental realm and announces he has inquiries for her. Receiving no response, he reflects that she always appeared independently, though when he seeks her, she remains silent, declaring the organism truly selfish. Joe interrupts them, stating this proves inappropriate for reminiscing. Yet Lin counters, claiming he does not even recognize him, and Corbin protests that he traveled this distance only to be mocked. Nevertheless, the physician inquires about current circumstances. Despite resolving the heating issue, a far more serious problem now exists. Since those pale-plated entities appear to be offspring of that mother, and these nests channel blood to her, this building will soon be assimilated. If they continue ignoring this, once the blood nests assume control, Lin completes her statement, saying they must confront the pale-plated entity with the intestinal blade, declaring that under those conditions, with his power, he could engage it. Yet Joe informs him it lacks simplicity. Since the indicator light remains constantly blue, and after utilizing Heshaw, it shines more intensely. Lin questions whether Heshaw represents that black form, and whether it also consumes substantial heat. Joe confirms that activating this state demands enormous heat, and presently insufficient amounts exist. Yet he alone possesses the capability to battle the pale-plated entities, and circumstances prove critical. Mo reflects that survival and continued protection required warmth. Then he announces having an idea. He asks the physician about spare planks, and Joe confirms their presence, though desires to understand the purpose. Lin takes the blade from Joe's grasp and requests to borrow the sacred physics sword. Since it mattered not whether blood nests outside or mutant pale-plated threats existed, the problem's core or primary conflict remained singular. He employs his power to advance and collect materials, as hunger provided the finest seasoning for those lacking strength to work, and consuming food granted strength. Joe states understanding it as a hydroponic system. Lin's logic proved truly distinctive, and Joe asks whether he intended cultivation there, though the youth replies it concerned honest workers' value and inherent ability, since increasing numbers were joining. Addressing the food problem took priority, reflecting that they understood hungry people's capabilities. Joe exhales smoke toward Lin's face and inquires about the next phase. Since the hydroponic system would not generate food spontaneously, the youth clenches his fists, prepared to commence. As he moves through the building, he notices that, predictably, the bodies had vanished and no blood traces remained, reflecting that something was collecting the corpses, and it might be that large individual from earlier. This meant limited time remained, and the blood nest would soon reach that level, requiring swift action. Lin wanted to employ the black form to eliminate the source completely. Yet before that, he needed to address the warmth and food problems. Corbin interrupts him, calling him Hey Slime and asking where he was sneaking alone. Lin questions how he followed him, though the fair-haired man replies that everyone understands, and Lin ignored it, since considering having a poor friend like him proved embarrassing. Nevertheless, he understood his friend, and now that he worked at a major company, a beggar like him received poor regard, and Lin wanted to know this person's relevance. Corbin continues stating that now they were alone, he could speak freely, though the youth simply finds him irritating. The fair-haired man places a hand on his shoulder and asks why his brother would not speak, though Lin simply replies they were doomed. Standing face to face with the large individual in the blood nest chamber, beneath a bridge, Corbin calls Jerry, since they were quite similar, having both been expelled and could only hide beneath the bridge from now on. He and the rodent would depend on each other, yet if he preferred not to, he need not leave. Besides, it was raining and Lin appears calling him. He states knowing his friend's location, since whenever he was expelled from somewhere, he hid there, asking how many times his father had beaten him, while Corbin asks whether he came merely to provoke him. Lin questions how he could act thus. Nevertheless, even if they were fleeing, they could not simply hide beneath an old bridge, and if they intended to escape, they should do so with style. Corbin asks where he learned those cliché phrases, though Lin extends his hand and calls Corbin, since if they were going to escape, it should be with a good friend to make it stylish. Corbin states he would only accompany, so Lin would stop fleeing from these things, and Lin thanked him. In the present, the youth grabs the fair-haired man by the neck, asking about his thoughts, shouting they should escape while holding his friend. Corbin protests that this escape lacked style entirely. At a distance, Lin states the nests appeared to have spread to the 4th level, and they needed to return for the seeds. Corbin protests they should be escaping with style, and his friend responds wanting to know why he was saying that in such circumstances. The fair-haired man asks whether it was not him who had said that, and Lin denies ever doing so. The two argue since Corbin believes Lin is pretending, and the youth denies it, though the discussion stops when an impact breaks the wall. The entity's hand penetrates through the structure. Lin dodges, thinking it was already too late, while Corbin is shocked by the entity breaking through the wall, supporting Lin's head, which was close to being crushed. The fair-haired man prepares his incendiary with a bottle, gaining the entity's attention and throwing the incendiary, shouting for the entity to release his brother. The monster attempts to defend against the fire with its hand, casting Lin aside while trying to extinguish the flames. The youth crashes into the blood nest. He notices that the vessels were adhering to him, since he was being absorbed by the blood nest attempting to escape. His face becomes covered in vessels, and even his hand was being consumed while Lin curses the situation, thinking everything would end thus. He opens his eyes with his smaller hand. Lin questions what is happening, wanting to know his location. Yet he notices something strange when examining the roots. Seeing that a pale-plated humanoid figure remains trapped, Lin questions whether it still lives, and the entity opens its eyes, looking toward the youth's direction and startling him. The environment changes and Lin touches his foot to the ground, wanting to know what is happening and where he is now. His vision shows his childhood self holding Corbin's hand. He states that was the intrusive fair-haired man from Aberdeen and questions whom he was addressing. Noticing it was himself, Lin questions whether they were truly friends and whether this was his memory. though his childhood version shouts that it was not, since he was not the fair-haired one. He was Kurt Cobain's friend, not Lin's, calling him a thief. Lin opens his eyes, almost entirely consumed by the vessels. Kurt pulls his hand, stating that dying thus would be pathetic. He manages to extract Mo from the vessels and asks whether he is okay, while the youth reflects that he almost became food for a blood nest, questioning what had just occurred. Nevertheless, he quickly decides to dismiss it as this was no time for contemplation, wanting to know their plan regarding that giant as it seemed unafraid of fire. Kurt grabs another incendiary and states that individual was quite tough, so he would offer him another drink. Lin interrupts him, telling him not to rush. The fat of the pale-plated ones burns rapidly at high temperatures, though the monster absorbed heat and possessed high regeneration. And Kurt realizes that Lin analyzed everything calmly, something unusual, throwing the incendiary with the intention of burning it until it cannot regenerate. And Lin asks whether he did not hear him, since this time the monster does not even bother defending against the fireburst. Lin decides to employ the black form as he cannot leave that thing there, yet nothing happens despite his attempt. He remembers the physician's words that he lacks sufficient energy now to use the black form, meaning he cannot fight this thing. Nevertheless, Lin is suddenly struck by a realization. From the beginning, it seemed somewhat familiar, the monster absorbing heat, and the physician mentioned that his High-On state did the same, so he gets an idea. At that moment, the entity slams the ground, sending the monster flying. In his previous life, the fortress had been attacked again, and before a cross, they hoped for a spirit to find peace. Linmo notices they had been losing people for a month. They had already changed locations countless times to avoid the pale-plated ones, though they always found them. And no matter how much they tried to escape, they still had to keep running. He tells old Joe that he has had enough, surprising the old man. After all, Lin Mo did not want to run anymore. Back in the fight, he realizes he had been correct since he could absorb energy from the environment. And so, the heat from the flames was also absorbed and converted into energy. Kurt questions why Lin has horns now. As the youth transforms, his Hashaw form starts to take shape, and his fist turns completely black, landing a full-force punch on the giant monster. Kurt shields himself from the wind and wants to know what is happening, since with a single punch his friend sent the monster flying. Lin calls Kurt Corbin and tells him to listen, since whatever he thought he knew about him before, it had nothing to do with now. He was no longer the same. Corbin is surprised and states his friend looks amazing in that outfit, asking where he got it. The fair-haired man had already accepted the fact that he could not call his friend a monster, though Lin denies it. Soon he changes the subject, stating that the large individual would be tough to deal with, asking how many incendiaries Kurt still had, and Kurt states he would check, opening his guitar case and showing that there were still plenty left. Nevertheless, the monster regains consciousness thanks to the punch and stands facing the two of them. Corbin asks what they are going to do and whether they are going to run. Lin questions whether he should flee. Having visions of what happened in his past, the youth becomes more determined, deciding that he will not run, since running away would make things boring. Corbin looks at his friend, thinking that he has really changed, calling him by the nickname Little Black. Lin reflects that the monster would not be so easily defeated since, even though it had regenerative abilities, it was still very slow, stepping on the monster's head. The youth prepares his fist to punch, causing multiple holes in the entity's body. Lin jumps back to retreat for a second, stating that now it was Kurt's turn. He throws all the incendiaries that were in the guitar case, causing a massive explosion against the monster. The entity's fat was flammable, so as long as the wound was deep enough, the fire would burn the fat, though it would not take long for it to regenerate. Thus, Lin brings his hands together to attack while it burns, since he would absorb the heat from the burned fat of the pale armor, and use the flesh and blood of his enemy for his own benefit. His monstrous form grows wings on his back, and his energy emanates more powerfully. He stomps on the ground, with force advancing rapidly, destroying everything in his path with his explosion of energy. Lin uses his foot to stop the impact, pointing his finger at the entity, and then getting close to it. He places his finger on its nose. The kinetic energy causes the entire structure of the entity to be destroyed with a mere touch. Corbin watches from afar and asks whether that was a sound barrier, while Lin reflects that as long as the entire body is destroyed, even the strongest regenerative ability is useless. Nevertheless, he only managed thanks to Kurt, and although he seems suspicious, he was truly helpful. He helps his friend up, asking whether he is okay while thinking that he looked sloppy but was not an idiot, and Kurt questions why he is being so polite, asking whether they were going downstairs to do that again, making Lin think he was an idiot. Corbin yells when they enter the apartment in room 409. He states he finally understands since they were there to get seeds and the nutrient solution, questioning when his friend learned about agriculture and how he got all these things, wanting to know also when he got his powers. Yet Lin mentally complains about finding an idiot even after being reborn. On Lin's necklace, a voice is heard trying to communicate. The youth is surprised while Corbin asks where he got such a cool necklace. Mo tells him to shut up and places his fingers on his nose. Corbin yells that he is hurting him and that he is bleeding, and Joe asks what the two are doing. Lin asks whether the necklace was for communication and also explains that he only managed to reach the room. The physician announces that she has good news, since they found some old things in the warehouse like this old radio station. They also found gardening supplies which the housewife probably used for planting flowers. Lin asks whether that was the good news, and the physician continues talking. Since she had a personal request, at the physician's house, Lin reflects that he could not believe he had returned to this place. Corbin comments that even that trashy building had a lab, and his friend states it was a clinic, though he was right. As they search for the capsule the physician wants, seeing a giant flask and asking what it is for. Since it seemed real and what Kurt said might be true, the physician might not actually be a physician. He sees a biohazard warning and questions whether the physician was studying the pale armor, wanting to know who the hell the physician really was. Corbin turns on the computer and Lin asks what he is doing, hitting his friend on the head and telling him not to mess with other people's computers, asking what if he deleted the physician's important information. Yet Kurt states he was not an idiot. Lin has a sudden realization and thinks about the information, telling Kurt to leave and calling him a lackey, which enrages his friend. Lin tells him to go and gather useful supplies, though Corbin tells him not to kick his guitar. He sits at the computer since he might find something important. Lin finally finds information on the computer, seeing a photo of her younger self, and noting that she was shy, also noticing the ID on her neck. The youth understands that the physician was hiding things from him. The base door opens. Joe greets Lin for returning, asking how it went, and Corbin explains that everything went well while Joe listens to the conversation, distant, watching the people. Lin explains that he managed to collect some seeds that were in the room due to the limited number of accessible floors, and unfortunately he did not find anything to eat directly, while Joe states it was not his fault, though Lou DeLongs for stealing the supplies. Then he asks for help planting, though Lin refuses since old Joe was injured. Zoe offers to help since she knew a bit about botany and biochemistry and could be useful, asking whether Lin did not think so. The youth agrees, looking suspiciously at the physician, though Kurt interrupts them, stating that he would help too, then changes his mind upon seeing their looks. Lin tells him to go to the kids' table with Maggie since he was not helping. Separated from the others, Joe asks about what she had requested earlier. Lin shows the flask and asks whether this is what she was referring to. Yet when the woman reaches for it, he steps back and tells her to wait, wanting to know whether she was not going to explain anything before taking it, since he needed to find out who the hell she really was. With a smile on her face, Joe asks whether he still had not figured it out. Lin notices the expression on her face and questions whether the physician did it on purpose. Joe remains silent, keeping her smile. The youth questions whether the capsule was just bait to lure him to her house, wanting to know what the former biochemical department agent, Joe Shuya, was planning. Joe grabs the flask and states he got half of it right, since it was not bait, though rather the key to humanity's survival. She asks whether he remembers when he became Sean, as he looks similar to the monsters, and she believes there is a connection between him and the entities. The organ reinforces this theory. Even in that state, it was still absorbing heat, much like what happened to Lin. The youth asks what this has to do with the key to survival and why she revealed her identity. Joe tells her test subject not to worry, since whether for food or for storing energy to face the mother outside, they needed to solve the planting problem quickly. And if she is not mistaken, when he created the hydroponic tank, he was thinking about using the red limit state to accelerate plant growth. In other words, the key to everything was Lin entering the red limit. Yet he did not have enough energy to fight, let alone reach that state. Even if he could absorb heat from the surroundings, he still would not be able, since his storage organs were not efficient enough yet to allow it. So, if she could add this organ, they could have a more efficient absorption system that would enable Linmo to enter the red limit. Lin stops, intending to think for a moment, though Joe presses the flask against his abdomen, summarizing that to survive, he needs to insert that into himself. The youth asks whether there would not be any rejection reaction, though black vessels begin to spread over the flask. Joe asks what that is. Then the vessels form a face and an immense force. Linmo also does not know what is happening, questioning whether the Black Fury wants a piece of the pale armor's flesh. The flask shatters on the ground, and Joe analyzes that the youth's body could not wait any longer. Thus, he enters the red limit state, collapsing to the ground as an entity emerges from his back. The physician questions whether his power source came from an organism, wanting to know how he could fit such a massive entity inside his body. Lin simply smiles in the red limit state. It was time to plant. He states the seedlings mature naturally, and the shelves were sterilized, free of green algae with only a few things missing. Yet he hears a noise from the top of the shelf. Maggie touches a plant and asks what it is, since it is so small. Lin states it is a lettuce seedling, and the little girl asks about seedlings. So the youth explains that it is a baby lettuce, just like little Maggie. The girl disagrees, stating that is not true since she is taller. And then she asks what lettuce even is. Dorothy appears and states it is the green vegetable in her favorite burger. So Maggie asks whether her mom can take her to eat a burger when her dad comes back. Dorothy tries to talk about her father, though Kurt comes up behind Lin and bluntly tells her that her father is gone, leaving the youth speechless, though he quickly interrupts Dorothy's train of thought and turns to Corbin, asking whether he brought the wheat seeds to make bread. Corbin responds that he did, and Lin follows up asking about tomato and cucumber seeds to make a burger. Then they ask little Maggie whether she would like a burger, since they would eat as soon as the little lettuce became big. Maggie asks how long that would take. Lin explains that if they were in ancient Greece, he would be the god of agriculture, and with him, plants would grow super fast. Then Maggie shouts that this is great. Dorothy thanks the guys, and Lin introduces himself as the guy from apartment 409. The woman states that they are trapped in this situation, and if they could at least make plants grow faster, they would not suffer from cold or hunger. Kurt states his friend is super talented and was not joking, though Lin interrupts him before he can mention his powers, dragging him away and asking him not to say anything since the fewer people who know, the better, and Kurt asks why. Lin tells him not to ask, remembering Joe mentioning that she worked on a fire in the field project during her time in the Secret Service. The security level of the program was high, and the departments involved were confidential, even among themselves. Yet she managed to obtain specific information, a project to infiltrate agents among civilians using drugs, brainwashing, and hypnosis, creating human monitors while the NSB protected the country. She did not know whether the NSB was paralyzed or not, or whether there were NSB monitors among them. Yet if they found out about him, nothing good would happen, and the fewer people who knew, the better. Lin agrees, stating he had a solution while hitting Kurt on the head. Corbin walks away with Dorothy, stating she did not need to worry since Lin was the god of agriculture. The youth looks around, searching for someone, though then he notices he was alone. He points his arm at the plants, deciding he would begin, focusing intensely with his eyes closed, then activating the red limit. Though he was being filmed by a camera, and it was being broadcast. A satellite beeps and communication asks whether it has been restored, restarting the system and connecting the satellite to search for whatever they could find in the sky. People ask what is happening since the area was frozen, and they would need to gather ground information to locate terrestrial equipment, activating the only 3 drones available. Nevertheless, since it was cold, the batteries would not last long, so they needed to collect as much information as possible before losing them. An employee asks what his superior was looking for, and he responds that he was searching for anything useful. She tells the boys to stay low since, with luck, they might find a sign of survivors or a rescue team. One of them responds that there was nothing interesting on his side, noticing the vein on the building and telling them to wait. As he gets closer, the vessels take over the transmission. Though the drone is immediately destroyed, the mother raises her bleeding hand and the drones question what that was and start recording. Yet the entity begins pulling the vessels from around it. A limb emerges from within the structure. The entire building shakes, including Lin's room. He questions whether it was an earthquake. He approaches Joe and asks what is happening, though the physician tells him to look outside, since it seemed like they were running out of time. As a gigantic entity appears staring through the window, Joe explains that this was what the mother had given birth to, the child. The being simply asks where it is, unintentionally, activating Lin's ability, wanting to know where its head was, extending its arm to use its ability. Kurt approaches the two and asks what was going on. The energy in the entity's hand starts generating lightning. Then Lin shouts for everyone to get down. The monster blows up a large part of the building with its ability. Lin closes his eyes to try to shield himself from the power, opening them again to look to the side. He holds Joe, thinking that was close, asking whether the physician was okay. She states yes and asks about the test subject, since they were very close and she notices his heart was beating fast. Lin suddenly pulls away and states it is good she is okay. Yet it was not time to relax as the entity was staring directly at them. Lin questions why those fragments were suspended in the air, questioning whether it was electricity or magnetism. Yet soon the child uses its ability again, firing the electrified stones forward, causing another explosion in the building area. Dorothy dodges while holding Maggie. Kurt asks what the hell is going on, thinking the whole situation sucks. He shouts, asking whether Lin is okay, though finds only the completely destroyed structure. Kurt curses, though then he hears a voice from below telling him not to be scared. It was the physician who had gotten stuck on a pillar and was asking for a hand. Kurt helps her up and asks where Lin is, and the physician tries to say where they were. Nevertheless, they are interrupted by the entity attacking. Dorothy screams for everyone to run as Corbin asks what the hell that thing was. Though the entity is suddenly slashed by a red energy, Joe identifies the color of the attack, and then the entity falls backward, crashing into a building. Lin stands in front of it in his pale armor mode, though now with red stripes instead of blue. A camera records the wreckage. The person watching asks whether this was the monster the rescue team had mentioned, the one lifting stones with its power, breaking the drone, which was the last one remaining. The people watching ask what they should do now. Pops explains that it has not been long since communications were re-established, so it will take a while for the bunker to make contact. A woman states the bunker just needed to wait since those in the field had a lot to think about, and his colleague asks why he does not prepare for exploration since they might find survivors. Pops refuses as the situation outside was uncertain and it was better to wait and see what might happen. Another explosion occurs at the site of the battle. Lin emerges from the smoke, his body outlined by a different armor, and even creating more energy horns. He reflects that this was beyond the red limit and seemed like something else, like rekindled embers, so he clenches his fist. The child throws more stones toward the youth, though he takes a deep breath in his monstrous body, sitting on the ground to advance, and quickly rising from the ground, heading toward the stones that were thrown at him. Lin leaps over each of the stones, sending them back. The entity keeps trying to control them, while the youth thinks that embers did not burn intensely and were instead burning silently like eternal sparks. The monster raises its hand and begins gathering several stones to launch at the boy, as if forming the structure of a meteor, and fires its ability at Lin. The attack approaches, and the youth reflects that the sparks were not dying out. He channels energy into his fist to continue his thought. Since all of this was like the prelude to a wildfire on a plain, Lin strikes the meteor with his fist, causing a shockwave that spreads across the entire block. A building explodes from the flying stone fragments, striking all the houses around, and even hitting the entity itself. Dorothy questions what that red thing was, and Kurt was about to explain, though Joe tells him to keep it a secret. Joe asks whether it was an angel, surprising the three of them. Since he defeated the entity and seemed like an angel sent by God, though his terrible face looked more like a demon. Lin falls to the ground now with wings forming at his waist. He reflects that this time, he had gone too far, causing immense destruction to the building. The organism asks whether it was not fine, since he was the only one who could handle this kind of power. Lin asks whether she was willing to leave and calls her an insect. The organism is surprised and asks whether he had something to tell her. The youth states he had many things. She raises her arms and states that thanks to the crazy physician who fed him the core, she was in a good mood. So if Lin wanted to ask something, he should do it now. Lin asks what exactly a pale armor was and was about to ask another question, though the organism places her finger on his mouth, stating they would do this little by little. She explains that pale armor would be more accurately described as an empty shell, like a body without a soul, entirely bound by the obsession of its past life, just like Lin was bound, or rather Mo, who lost his life in the other timeline. Since time was not continuous for the organism, Lin could die, and she would leave that timeline and move to another one. In this process, the soul and consciousness would go with her, leaving Lin's body behind. Since the version of him that lost his soul would turn into an empty shell, and perhaps his shell was fighting somewhere out there. Lin reflects that all the places where conflicts arose in his memory now made sense, and the organism tells him he understood quickly. The youth realizes that technically he had not been reincarnating, though rather traveling through time. The youngster commences molting its outer layer, due to an inner nucleus residing within its form, while flames manifest atop its skull. Lin comprehends that every pale suit of armor represented otherworldly entities that had journeyed across temporal dimensions. Shalou inquires of Barbara regarding their objective, and she responds that should the individual from the terrain who transformed into a beast have delivered a package, they must examine its contents, though her assistant protests, claiming it represented the most classified evidence level and their superior would express fury. However, shortly, they discovered the parcel lay before them. The youngster cries out for its cranium, questioning its location while generating an explosive burst of power through the flames crowning its head. Lin shields himself from the force utilizing his limbs, demanding explanations for the events and whether this entity possessed immortality. The symbiont declares it represented a unique offspring and they ought to interrogate it, while Lin ponders why it continued such extensive communication when this typically never occurred. She responds that they all constituted her essence, and temporal flow lacked linearity, though he remained foolish. Lin questions if this moment suited such discourse, and whether she behaved childishly due to circumstances. The youngster launches an assault, and Lin observes its velocity reached extreme levels. Yet the creature prepares another electromagnetic discharge within its palm, utterly shocking the youth in his current state. He evades, stating he nearly fell victim, and the entity moved with genuine swiftness, though compared to his transformed condition, it meant nothing. The youngster positions its palm against the earth and grasps rocks, hurling them in Lin's direction, who questions why he levitated and whether gravity caused this effect. Subsequently, the being draws him nearer, seizing the youth by his throat. Lin realizes the monster drains his thermal energy and declares this situation dire, wondering whether they shared identical origins. The symbiont emerges and states complete mutual drainage proves difficult, while Lin complains about her return. Azure appendages sprout from the youth's spine, forcing away the creature's grip, casting it a great distance. Additional armor materializes behind Lin, adopting a monstrous visage yet feminine physique. The symbiont announces she must handle this personally, considering Lin's state. The youth observes her with amazement, while the symbiont asks whether he expected her to remain dormant within him as a spectator. Though the youth should not feel surprise because with the secondary nucleus, she would construct another vessel. The youngster charges toward both of them, yet the symbiont declares this will destabilize the energy equilibrium. She then raises her limb, impacting the creature, while stating she lacks time for delays. The being employs its power at its extremity. Lin cautions the symbiont about the gravitational manipulation recurring, though she tells the youth not to worry because since escape from gravity proved impossible, they would rise. Therefore, she contacts his torso. Azure energy transfers to Lin, fracturing the entire surface surrounding them. The symbiont experiences gravitational pull, while the creature advances rapidly with its appendage. Nevertheless, a blade appears within the symbiont's grasp. Fire encompasses the youngster's cranium. Subsequently, it avoids the symbiont's strike, receiving a shallow wound upon its shoulder, leaving the impacted region stripped of protective covering. An observer watches from afar through optical equipment and announces they have located 13. Their companion questions whether she remained in this vicinity, and the woman confirms it was not distant, though current circumstances proved unsuitable for reclamation because she had discovered a fascinating individual. The symbiont states this represented his genuine capability, and fighting without weapons proved wasteful. Lin then wonders whether another function existed. The being repaired its appendage, yet she suddenly forms a curved blade since she possessed identical abilities. The individual removes his headwear and states he never anticipated 13, the Sacred Mother, would be forced into this condition. He intended to exploit the revelation's chaos to steal 13's powers and subsequently her head to locate the organization, though he never expected this development. Arena desires to interfere, yet he states this would reveal their movements and the logistics organization would not halt for a revelation. The girl concurs with Father Cross and declares it occurred because they were selected by Divine Spirit. Another woman embraces Arena from behind and tells the priest not to maintain such seriousness, pressing her torso against the girl's back. She states little Arena had belonged to the prophetic organization since youth, so caring for one requires patience. Arena questions her touching locations. The priest warns that Ginyu arrived late. The woman explains that handling the insects pursuing them proved challenging. The priest therefore thanks her for her safety. Since everyone had assembled, they should observe the distant performance because the scheme was about to be revealed. The youngster launches an assault employing its curved weapon. Lin wonders whether it constituted a shock wave that drew objects, yet the symbiont simply rushes forward, calling his name. He reflects that moments earlier she utilized the attraction force to create a massive detonation and now attempted the identical strategy. He then tells the symbiont to pause because it represents deception. The symbiont expresses surprise upon approaching. Becoming caught by a series of attacks, she deflects with her blade. The curved weapon's repulsion force sends the symbiont flying considerable distance. The creature then charges from the ground, targeting a downward blow at the symbiont's head. She feels startled by the attempt, yet receives the impact. Her curved blade embeds in the earth, though nothing remained there. Searching ahead for the pair, Lin cradles the symbiont in his arms and states that, as he mentioned previously, she moved quickly. Though compared to him, the youngster lagged at least 500 cosmic velocities behind. The symbiont rises and declares this represented the youngster's power and not an ordinary shell, while Lin responds that he sensed it. She surpassed the other pale armors in strength. Father Cross explains that a vessel should remain hollow, yet it fills with spirit and lacked harmony. This thought occurred when he first observed 13. Since she embodied both a divine offspring and an empty vessel simultaneously, her spirit and flesh remained disconnected, though she exceeded white armor in superhuman qualities while retaining aspects of both. Jo reflects that she believed it merely represented her imagination. However, this situation, she requests her experimental subject not to disappoint her. Lin simply attempts to maintain calmness and avoid anxiety because she had released the attraction force previously and her body parts turned white both occasions. However, the bronze sections could employ repulsion force. He then comprehends the creature's ability. Lin asks whether the symbiont had not instructed him to incinerate her moments ago, therefore they should amplify their firepower. The symbiont repeats that statement, yet with a smile she agrees and declares her understanding, requesting Lin to extend his hand. The young individual feels surprised by the symbiont's action. She places his hand between her chest, and Lin questions her intentions. A fracture forms in her body, molding a weapon's handle for Lin. The youngster charges again with her curved blade, yet the sword emerges from the symbiont's torso. Before the youngster's attack can reach them, Lin completely draws the massive sword and blocks the curved weapon, surprising the youngster with the raw power, which creates a detonation that repels her. The monster crashes to the surface with its arms folded, while Lin rests the blade on his shoulder, walking steadily toward the youngster. The symbiont advances from behind her since the left appendage could release the repulsion force. Therefore, she should be attacked from the left, compelling her to use repulsion force for defense. The curved blade begins to distort as Lin thinks that to control his opponent's attack trajectory. This moment represented when his optimal opportunity to strike had arrived, advancing with his wings. Therefore, he would counterattack from the monster's right, compelling her to use the attraction force to draw him closer. Attraction force could only serve defensive purposes, therefore she could only alter the path of Lin's assault. In this instance, that was precisely what the young individual desired, because it would prove that her body functioned like a magnet following magnetic currents. These currents became Lin's acceleration zones, because by adding the kinetic energy from his rapid speed, that was the precise moment to give his all. Lin causes a detonation in the area with his assault. He takes a deep breath after delivering the blow. While the youngster looks upward, Lin had succeeded in piercing the creature with the sword. The symbiont follows up with an overhead strike, targeting to deliver the final blow to conclude the battle. Cross prays for God to protect his chosen offspring. Employing his golden pilgrimage assault, Light carries Arena onto the battlefield. Gu questions whether she was transported correctly since it might cause some discomfort, though the girl states she feels fine and summons the holy coffin. The symbiont was about to strike from above when Arena draws her blade. She states it feels interesting because it resembles looking in a mirror. Arena had a protective covering over her eye shielding her. She finally unsheathed her blade, slashing at the symbiont. Lin asks who this girl was, as she approaches because he thought she was a superhuman. 13 deconstructs in front of them both. Arena grasps its core with her hand, and as the symbiont tries to intervene, Jinu warns of a sneak attack. The girl flips her blade around, blocking the symbiont strike. She hurls the monster far away. Lin catches her by the waist. Arena, holding the core in her hand, says that 13 is safe, and she wants to return quickly, though Cross asks for a moment. The priest says he could see her from there and would mark her as a direct target. Therefore, she should jump when the time came because he did not want to bring the ground beneath her down as well. Lin wonders what Arena is trying to do as the girl crouches and says it feels troublesome. The young individual wants to know why a human is trying to save a white armor, yet Arena just jumps off the ground. Cross instructs Jinu to capture her properly. The woman appears holding Arena in her arms and welcoming her. The girl feels surprised to be received by Jinu. She tells Arena not to worry about 13, though the girl curses Cross for doing it on purpose. The priest asks whether she also wanted to crash into the ground when she was taken there because his ability had limits. Arena, irritated, throws 13's core at Cross, who reflects that it might take a little longer to incubate a new body while Jinu annoys Arena. Cross asked 13 to be a good girl and sleep in the process, since the leader of the Prophetic Association had told them before to move carefully and he could not challenge a leader. However, he really wanted to talk to the other two who had defeated 13 while Lin says they escaped. The battlefield was completely destroyed. Joe comments that there was too much smoke and he could not see the situation. Joe says it seemed to be over and Corbin wanted to know about the monster. The doctor warns that they seem to be safe, though Maggie wanted to know about Lin Mo. The officer calls for Lin while trying to see through the smoke, wondering whether Lin had gotten out of there. The young individual appears and asks why everyone was looking down, because today he had to get up from the third floor. In the medical room moments later, Joe questions whether Lin hit his head, as it seemed like a blessing from God. The young individual agrees, and Joe tells him to move his hand because she was going to take a look. Lin says he feels fine and whispers to the girl that it is not necessary. Joe responds that he would not lose anything by letting her check, then whispers back that they should act properly. Joe says that everyone being okay could be considered pure luck, though due to the shock waves, the pipes broke outside and the heating system probably would not work anymore. Therefore, after a big round, they were back to square one. Yet, Lin tells him not to be pessimistic since the situation was not as bad as he thought. When he went up the stairs, he discovered that the blood nest had disappeared, meaning they could go down to check the lower floors. Yet their group was the only one alive in the building, though it was not time to grieve, since they needed to find the former residents' supplies to block the wind and rain. Therefore, he tells Joe not to worry too much, because he would let everyone know to relocate, while Joe trembles with his phone in hand, saying that the agency wasted no time. Outside, someone knocks on a truck. The doors open and the soldier greets Captain Pops, Sergeant Rhodes, and Corporal Lee, saying that he was Secret Agent Zion White and was there to deliver the bunker's orders to capture the superhuman Lin Mo. Corbin asks whether that was what Lin meant by dirty business, while Maggie wonders whether that meant they were safe now, and Joe would not say they were completely safe because, after all, the situation outside was bad, since the heater was broken. Lin says they had to use this opportunity to move the base. It was the best decision, since in any case they still had the building and could use the lower floors, and the central heating system was still working. Joe comments that it was not enough because they were not just fighting the cold and needed defensive structures, and Lin says she was right and that he would do his best, asking whether Joe still had some personal defense equipment in the security department, and the officer says he thinks so. Not just personal defense equipment, because before the disaster, Brooklyn's public security had upgraded its gear, and now they had some weapons and vests. Therefore, if they used everything, they might be able to take care of the entire building, though he was not sure whether they would be effective against monsters. Corbin tries to say that he has an idea, because he discovered that if he played a certain tone, the monsters could not move, and that should be the power of music. Lin says that feels ridiculous, and Joe agrees, making Corbin angry. The young individual tells everyone that he and Kurt would go down first to check the situation while Corbin complains, asking them to hear his explanation. Lin orders him to stop wasting time, and Corbin asks for a moment. As they are being recorded, Mo says they should just inspect the lower floors, though Kurt wants to put his guitar back in its case. In an apartment, Corbin comments that he had not noticed before, though Lin was living really well, since he had been living in a small town in Seattle, asking whether his friend was doing something illegal, while the young individual asks whether that constitutes all. Reflecting that, given his current situation, even the ordinary seemed extravagant, because a sudden freeze in those white armors appeared so abruptly that even living a normal life was extravagant. Even this rare moment of serenity, Lin wondered how long it would last, because after all, everyone was tired and needed time to rest. Joe looks at a card while taking a bath, realizing she needed to sort out her feelings. Maggie was looking at a photo of her father with Dorothy, because no matter how hard it was, there was no reason to give up. Because even with their bodies and minds covered in wounds, they needed to survive without scruples. Therefore, for Lin, there were some things that needed to be explained clearly. He calls Corbin, and his friend asks what it is. Mo says that what he was about to tell Kurt might be unbelievable. His friend then asks why he was suddenly saying things like that. Yet Lin says that whether he accepted it or not, what he was saying was the truth. Kurt asks whether his brain disappeared after fighting the monsters. Yet Lin questions whether the Lin Mo, who was his friend, would not recognize him, and even his good friend, whom he had known for years, had become a superhuman. Kurt should have doubts about that. The young individual explains that the person standing in front of him was someone who should not be alive, a Lin Mo from another timeline who had taken over the body of Kurt's friend, and the real owner of the body was no longer there, surprising Kurt with the exaggerated explanation. Lin says it was difficult to accept, and not believing him was part of what he expected, though he was telling him because he was a good friend of the original owner of this body. And after days, it would only get more difficult. Therefore, he did not want to put him in trouble by hiding the truth from Kurt. Corbin comments that he was basically a Lin Mo who never had a bad friend during childhood, and asks whether that was correct. Lin feels surprised by the young individual's response, yet Kurt continues saying they should get to know each other again, introducing himself as Kurt Corbin, a good friend of Lin Mo. The young individual just laughs at the introduction. Then Kurt puts his cigarette in his mouth, asking about all that he had just said, because in the end he was still Lin Mo, and if this Lin Mo lost his life and crossed into someone else's body, he probably thought he sounded cool saying things like that. Lin grabs his friend's hand and introduces himself as Lin Mo, though tells Kurt not to smoke in his room, and Kurt apologizes. Outside the building, a car drives through the snow. Rhodes calls Pops an old individual, asking why they should join the field workers if they were just a rescue team. The individual stays silent for a second, and says he knew that Agent White was being pressured by time, though asks whether they did not need to exchange some information first. White replies that there was no time to waste because he knew what they were going to ask. And as a rescue team, they must have noticed that very little information had been provided beforehand. There was a group of humans trying to capture the target before them. It would take too long to explain everything. Therefore, he would give the main points. Because right after the freezing began, the National Intelligence Bureau activated the National Crisis Management Protocol. At that time, communications were cut off, and the execution of the protocol became chaotic. Pop says that during that same period, their team received no orders and was left on standby, though he had mentioned before that the communication failure was not a technical issue. White explains that no matter how strong the monsters were, they could not have destroyed the backup communication plan as well. That was human action. The commander says that thinking about it, the disaster and everything that happened was too convenient. White agrees, adding that fortunately, communications were restored. However, the Intelligence Department and the Biosafety Department suspected that this series of events had been orchestrated by a strange secret organization. Rhodes appears and says that he claimed there were no records of them in the CIA, though even the National Intelligence Group could not detect them. Because whether a person was alive or not, they should have respirators. He should save that story for children. She had been in the intelligence department as well, and a ghost organization should have left some kind of trace. White says that espers would be the correct term instead of ghosts. Rhodes asks whether that was not the code for the operation's target, and White explains that if he had not gone through this himself, he would also think it was ridiculous. Yet the result was obvious. He then removes a pendant from his neck. He shows it to the soldiers, surprising Pops and Rhodes, who offer their condolences. White explains that the Esper organization was as secret as a ghost, though they knew they were the enemy. Pops deduces that the higher-ups believed the target was another Esper. Lee drives the car and assumes that the Esper organization was trying to recruit others, though asks for forgiveness if he was wrong. White explains that his clearance level was not high enough to know the details of the matter, and perhaps Corporal Lee was right, because as far as he understood, Subject Zero was the only detected Esper, and given their current situation, he was the only option for understanding. Hence, the bunker had targeted him. The car stops suddenly. Pops asks what happened, and Lee calls his chief, because there were 2 survivors standing in front of the truck. The captain looks through the car's rearview mirror and says it feels strange, though he will step out first to check. He gets out in front of the 2 and asks whether they are okay, introducing himself as an agent of the National Intelligence Bureau, offering to help them. Both survivors thank him, asking for help to get out because Brooklyn had turned into hell while White listens to the conversation, holding his weapon. Pops explains that it feels a bit complicated, thinking that although they are a combat team, they have an urgent mission now, though he cannot leave them behind as it is his duty, surprising the two survivors. He has a commitment to get to and informs the two civilians that there are some supplies in the car and that he can share them. Both ask about the supplies with a dark expression. Then the girl pulls out a knife while Pop says he knows times are tough, though they should calm down as he tries to reach for his gun. However, the survivors hold him back to prevent it. The girl suddenly tries to attack with the knife, though is stopped by precision shots to the chest. White was aiming at them from a distance, landing a shot to the other individual's head. Someone on top of a building has a Molotov. Though White had already spotted them from afar, the person lights the Molotov as the soldier aims his rifle at them and focuses it, with his sights focused on the Molotov. He fires again with his sniper, exploding the bomb before it can hit them. Pops manages to land a kick on one of the survivors, hitting the other with an elbow strike to the chest, while White finishes them off with a headshot. Pops pulls his pistol and shoots the woman in the chest, finishing her with a shot to the head. White notices one of the survivors coming at him with an axe, though he turns to grab the gun at his waist, pulling the trigger and firing at the survivor with ease. He falls with multiple shots to his arms and legs while White finishes him with a shot to the head. Pops shouts that he is safe and the soldier does the same. Then he gets back in the car and Rhodes asks him something. Pops wants to know what is wrong, though Rhodes questions whether they were not survivors, saying that people are driven to madness and hoping that Subject Zero was not. Corbin warns his friend that he had placed it there, though Lin is drawing along with Joe, who comments that the place could be used as a greenhouse. Kurt says that people who do not know any better would think they are doing zero shopping. To summarize the group's plan, the east side of the third floor would be converted into a plant greenhouse, while the west side would be suitable for living. Since the sixth floor was severely damaged and the others were affected, it was safer for everyone to stay on the third. As for the first and second floors, they would be set with traps, and the security room would serve as a forward outpost or command center, though Lin felt like something was missing. Joe comments that he could handle it with one hand when he was younger, and Corbin tells him he is bragging. The officer asks whether they are going to the garage to try it out. Then Kurt accepts the old individual's challenge. Lin thinks this feels really childish, though Joe warns him through the communicator that he should come to her. The young individual asks what it is, though the doctor tells him he will know when he gets there. Therefore, the young individual does and goes to her asking what she needs, though Joe says that in the last battle he had mentioned seeing his own kind. The young individual agrees and says she was the one who stole the white armor's core. Joe says she has something to tell him, playing a message from someone telling the survivors not to blame themselves amid the frost. Lin asks why she is making him listen to this, though the doctor tells him to keep listening. The audio states that in the past, God sent the flood to wash away the sins of the world. This place had always been brainwashed by the government, which monitored everything, and public and private debts were contracts, forcing them to sin. Yet God was merciful to people, therefore the pure souls would be blessed. And then Jinu finds a white armor. She touches its chest, making her hand intangible, pulling out a rocket launcher from inside, and aiming at the monster. She fires, obliterating the creature in just a second. Thus, it ceases to exist instantly. The message states that the lost lambs would find hope in the apocalypse led by the holy children. Therefore, this was judgment upon the evil government. Surprising Corporal Lee as he listens to the message, Cross touches the girl's hand with his power. The message continues, warning that they should join them because the Holy Sun would protect them and absorb their sins, and then the priest would lead them to his kingdom. Joe asks whether he had any idea about what he just heard. Lin just thought it was an anti-government cult, and the blessing and the Holy Sun they mentioned seemed to be espers. Joe says that if that was the case, it was possible, though things had gotten very serious, because for a long time there had been a human legend, whether it was the Freemasons or the Illuminati, though now the Society of Prophets. A dark cult carried out external dirty work, though the dog bit back, infecting the Pentagon, so they created the NLSB to fight against it. This story was almost forgotten and was something that should have been forgotten. Yet now the prophetic society that was once eliminated had resurfaced thanks to the ice apocalypse. Lin asks whether what she just said was not classified information, though she had worked in the biosafety department. Joe explains that unfortunately she also had a terrible friend, and she was an intelligence agent, or rather, a former agent. Rhodes suddenly sneezes and Lee asks whether she is okay. The girl says that the Society of Prophets was eradicated, not dissolved, and the NLSB was not as incompetent as the CIA, therefore she had a bold hunch. That Society of Prophets with espers was from another universe. Just like Lin, a ghost. The young individual feels surprised that she knew all that, wondering whether she had been listening to everything thanks to the pendant on her head. Joe exhales smoke and says it feels touching and a little sweet for two individuals, though Lin yells that it constitutes a bond between friends. The doctor continues saying that if that was the case, maybe the Society of Prophets had noticed Lin, and in any case they had an enemy to protect themselves against. She asks whether he was not going to move, and they should help carry his things without forgetting the ashtray. While Lin says she called him just for that, Lee turns off the radio and says that it was not surprising that the intelligence department had not found records if it was the Society of Prophets, asking Rhodes whether there was any secret. The woman says it was more than a secret. It was related to the National Intelligence Cabinet, though the superiors had thoughts. However, a hand covers her mouth. Pops tells Sergeant Rhodes not to forget that she was transferred to the field department. White listens to a message saying that although communication was restored, it was still unstable and needed to be quick. Because it was now confirmed that the Society of Prophets was connected to espers, and therefore capturing Target Zero was the highest priority. And to help complete the mission quickly, the superiors had decided to grant him high authority as an exception. Any form of resistance at this moment was a threat to the plan to save humanity. Therefore, having maximum authority meant he could eliminate any threat as he saw fit, and activate other agents at any time. Inside room 303, a burger is held by a hand. Then Maggie takes a big bite. Dorothy comments that she did not expect Lin to make food grow so fast, and she really could praise a burger thanks to him. Lin says that what he learned in agricultural school, and if she wanted to thank someone, it should be science. Joe opens the fridge, surprised by a bottle. Dorothy says she found it while organizing supplies and heard that Joe wanted to drink something. Therefore, she chilled a bottle for him. Joe thanks her, pouring tequila into a glass of water, then cutting a lime in half. Owie hands the drink with salt to Mr. Lin. Lin asks the old individual what that was. Joe says that the most authentic tequila should be paired with the most traditional way of drinking it, and he offers this drink to his savior. Therefore, they should sit down and enjoy the delicious food. Lin thanks him for the drink and says he would not be reclusive. Then he runs the lime over his tongue and drinks the tequila with his finger, finishing by sucking on the sour lime. Joe offers the drink to the doctor, though she explains that she smokes because she does not drink, while Lin starts feeling sick from the alcohol. Dorothy comments that she has not seen Mr. Corbin, though Lin says he was on duty. Dorothy says she will take his share, though Lin says there is no need to trouble herself, though the housekeeper insists. The soldiers were watching this scene from outside. White tells everyone to prepare to check communications. This was the alpha test. Rhodes at the base says she feels fine, and HQ was received calling for Bravo and Delta. Bravo, who was Pops, confirms receipt, and Delta, who was Lee, does the same. Thus, the soldier says he will leave the communication to the kid. Rhodes informs Pops and Lee that they were experiencing interference and that she needed to readjust. Both ask about it, though Bravo explains that the adjustment would be done as quickly as possible. Rhodes agrees and says she switched to the private channel. Pops asks what that was and why she was being mysterious, though Rhodes questions whether they should use force, since Target Zero did not seem dangerous, and she felt that the field agent was hiding something from them. Bravo agrees with her and believes the higher-ups are involved given that intelligence has the sense. Yet as her captain, he does not want anything to happen. Therefore, even though he says that, he will not stop the girl, asking her to be careful, while Rhodes calls him again, saying that the adjustment is complete, and finally initiating the operation. Lin pours more drink into Joe's glass and asks whether he has a daughter. Joe explains that he had a family, though had not seen his daughter in about 20 years. He was frozen outside and wondered how she was doing, while Joe warns that he was injured and should drink less. Then Joe apologizes to his daughter for already being drunk, surprising Lin. The individual holds Joe's hand and calls out to his daughter, Wana. Joe feels surprised by the coincidence in the name, though says nothing. Then he continues saying it was his fault for not protecting his daughter and her mother. Lin laughs, and Joe asks why he is laughing while Joe keeps begging his daughter to forgive her father. The young individual reflects that if they were not in the middle of the ice apocalypse, at that moment, they would seem like a family. Though the lights suddenly go out, Lin wonders whether the generator broke, and Joe notices that something feels off. Joe suddenly stands up and says, "The time has come." Lin wonders where old Chia is going, though the individual remains silent. Joe simply grabs a knife, unsheathing it while looking enraged. Inside the apartment, White comes face to face with a barrier and says it feels completely blocked and that it seems right. Lee asks whether the informant was reliable, and Pops suggests they test it. The corporal manages to open the maintenance tunnel and decides they will go in. Bravo keeps moving and communicates to HQ that they have reached the 3rd floor. Rhodes instructs HQ to turn on the monitor because she needs video, and they should split up and search according to the plan, locating the civilians and then securing the target. White says there are only 3 of them and that they need to support the others in emergencies, and there is no need for formalities at a time like this, and the soldiers agree. They split up with White heading up the stairs. Joe is masked inside the 3rd floor, ready to attack the soldiers with stealth. Lin asks what the situation is now, and Joe says she does not know. Therefore, the young individual stays silent, looking ahead. Joe looks at him and nods. Corbin suddenly appears in the apartment and calls out to them because something big happened. Some guys with guns had shown up and they did not look friendly. Lee appears and announces that he is safe, and Pops does the same. Though Joe suddenly collapses, still masked. Pops points his gun at him, and Lee does the same. Joe remains silent as the soldiers wonder whether he constitutes a civilian. Pops announces that they are with the National Rescue Team, and Lee contacts HQ about encountering civilians. Then the captain tries to touch Joe's shoulder, saying they are there to help. Yet Joe questions that help, repeating the part about being the National Intelligence Bureau's rescue team, asking since when they started doing such humane things. Rhodes recalls the mask on his face, saying it feels good that the internet works, searching and finding him. The woman informs Bravo that he is not an ordinary civilian, and the individual asks what she means. Machete, an NSLB agent, escaped from prison after destroying cartels in San Diego using traffickers' intestines as rope, and was then recruited for special missions. Pops comments that he constitutes one of them. As he draws his weapon, Joe repeats the words, "one of them," then unsheathes the knife from its scabbard, and slices Pop's hand, saying that he took the life of his jade. 2 of Pops's fingers are severed by the swordsman, who charges again, saying that he took Wana from him. Pops grabs the knife with his wounded hand. Then Joe asks how he dares to say he constitutes one of them. Lee aims through Pops to shoot at Joe, then orders his superior to duck, firing at Joe. Though the bullet merely ricochets off the mask, Joe kicks Pops away, pulling a kunai from his waist, and throwing it toward Lee. The knife moves rapidly toward the individual, striking him fatally. White tries to call Bravo and Delta to report, though the communicator does not work, and he wonders what was happening. Lin appears behind him and says that despite all this snow and wind outside, people were still invading other people's homes. White tries to draw his pistol, though as he goes to fire, the individual had already disappeared. Lin tells him that he constitutes a noisy intruder. White introduces himself, saying that he is an agent of the NSLB and that he is there to capture Lin Mo. The young individual vanishes again, leaving only traces behind, asking whether he was going to arrest him because that was interesting, as he was not concerned about the ice, only about capturing him, wanting to know whether it was his duty to maintain order after the collapse, or whether he was still hiding something. White turns again to shoot at Lin, telling him not to challenge him because he really would fire. Lin says he had better be sure he could actually hit him. With that, the individual fires his sniper rifle, activating its absolute precision mode. Lin dodges the bullets using his acceleration and rushes forward, striking White's head with just one blow. The individual's focus device falls to the ground. Lin notices that something was off because he had clearly aimed at his head, though White says it was close. Yet luckily, his intuition had always been sharp, and Lin must be wondering why he did not twist his head. His intuition told him the trajectory of Lin's attack. Simply put, he could even predict whether Lin was going to fart just by the way he lifted his butt. Lin asks who the hell he was, though White activates a similar ability and asks whether he had not already told him, because he was the National Intelligence Bureau agent, Zeon White, and people called him an Esper. Rhodes tries to contact Alpha, saying she cannot see his screen. She whistles, trying to reach Zeon, calling HQ and requesting reinforcements. Lee panics, shouting for reinforcements while yelling that he and Pops had been hit. Several knives fly toward the pair, striking their backs and vests. Joe slowly approaches the fallen duo, while Lee points his weapon at him. They feel surprised to see that the individual is no longer in their line of sight. Then Joe suddenly appears behind them. Stones hit him out of nowhere, saving the two. Lin collides with his old friend Joe. He reflects that he was careless just as a creature invades the room. Lin looks back, wondering who he bumped into, though soon smells alcohol and realizes it was the old individual, Chow. The young individual helps Joe up and asks who the two of them were. Pops asks them to listen to what they had to say about their identities, though the creature stomps its foot on the ground. Lin explains that they need to deal with that guy first. Pops just reports to HQ through the radio, asking whether it was an empty shell and informing them that he had made contact with one. The creature swiftly moves its pupil downward, preparing an electricity attack against Pops, though White pulls the strings and orders it to wait, stopping the creature from moving its arm. Zeon explains that Lin Mo was the target. He warns Lin with just a look while the young individual grits his teeth, preparing for combat, acknowledging that it appeared to be a difficult and inescapable confrontation. Afterward, he carefully sets Joe down and offers his regrets. Having owed him another beverage, he starts his transformation into a beast. White mentions it was anticipated from the primary subject, and witnessing it firsthand remained shocking, though Lin inquires whether that indicated Zeon possessed knowledge. The beast springs forward to seize Lin. Nevertheless, he merely triggers his speed enhancement, observing the assault in delayed motion. Lin glances backward, thinking he was unable to battle in that location, tightening his power-filled fist and hitting the sonic wall to redirect the strike. The being is surprised by this action. White wonders whether that constituted a sonic barrier, and if Lin truly succeeded in deflecting attacks through it. Lin rushes toward the pair, jumping from the upper floor alongside the beast. He hits the barrier once more, questioning whether it consisted of energy. A debris blast erupts as the trio impacts the floor. Lin stands, declaring this would be challenging, because the beast itself represented a form of ability. Yet the barrier posed the greatest obstacle. Still, he refused to view himself as entirely hopeless, observing chains. Therefore, he determines he must apprehend the commander first, while White advises him to surrender because everything he attempts is pointless. Lin crouches and creates his energy appendages and spike, considering that velocity was his strength, and shouts, how could he discover without attempting it? Propelling himself from the surface with power, obliterating everything in his path. White evades, questioning if he had not already stated so, since his instinct had already predicted the direction of Lin's assault. Then its lower arm develops a blade, readying to rush forward as well. White declares that Lin was not the sole one present with a speed benefit. The assault injures Lin Mo. He questions what is occurring. As the beast charges to strike again, he observes that despite its mass, it remains swift. Thus, the monster drives the blade from its lower arm, shocked by the youth. Because its strike failed to reach his neck, Lin grasps the blade, stating it was too near. White instructs Lin Mo to cease struggling, directing his weapon at Lin's skull, because dragging a body in such weather was bothersome. Lin says not to address him in that manner, and wonders if the superiors would permit him to perish there, since White was merely a servant of the National Intelligence Bureau. Some stone pieces float from the surface, startling White as he observes the fragments, which merge and create something. Lin deflects the weapon aside, and the fragment structure completes its formation, making the youth rush toward it. White attempts to maintain aim at the monster, but Lin had already reached the blade, clutching its handle firmly and generating a tremendous explosion of devastation behind White, who questions what is happening. Because once Lin seizes the blade, additional lightning emerges. His face partially becomes pale. Then he extracts the fragment blade from the surface,